a vital last resort, when the clear justification arises, that means I can adopt an IPM approach. And I'm all the time building a blueprint and a dossier of knowledge to refer to in coming years. And the principles of IPM drives and shapes that entire strategy. So commercially independent advice and that independent mindset is the natural home in which to employ IPM to its fullest. Now, IPM underpins all of my decisions, but documented, proven science and any wider sources of information to help me understand IPM has been minimal. It's been very much trial and error, working off personal experience and speaking to like-minded individuals. There's no handbook on IPM, but there's one for every pesticide. There's no guidance or app that states how many money spiders a square metre I need to control BYDV aphids once 170 growing day degrees of reef. How many parasitoids, predatory ground beetles, entomopathogenic nematodes or fungi need to be there to deal with cabbage stem flea beetle? Because the main source of our knowledge is our experience. But the most limiting factor to full IPM adoption is that we live in such a litigious society, and too many worry about the consequences of getting it wrong, compared to the perceived security of spraying. And because so many non-chemical treatments have been tried in the past and turned out to be expensive and pretty unreliable, full IPM adoption has stalled, I think. IPM, personally, I think it's more widely practiced in the independent sector, where IPM thought processes have always been prioritised as a matter of routine, and pesticide usage is routinely optimised anyway. But we as the independent advice sector are increasingly reliant upon IPM as the shared wisdom evolves. But to ensure that we broaden the IPM mindset, we need the biological and alternative options to be reliable and proven alternatives so that they become just as trustworthy as plant protection products are today. There needs to be more awareness and acceptance that if pesticide alternatives are fully implemented, mistakes are going to be made, and we cannot turn an imprecise science into precision, no matter how hard we try, whether that be with biologicals or plant protection products. But that is where our portfolio of plant protection products become even more important tools in an applied IPM systems, because we need that support for when all else fails. Sadly, of course, there's no financial support or protection, nor is there any incentive which offsets the risk of a full implemented IPM programme. And by that, I mean by reducing plant protection products to a minimum and replacing them with organic, biological or cultural approaches. There's nothing there to protect the grower or the advisor if it all goes wrong, nor is there a sufficiently diverse library of supporting information to back up an open IPM mindset. And when IPM goes wrong, it really does go wrong. I can attest to that. If a pesticide fails, as long as the product was used in accordance with a label, there's a degree of manufacturer responsibility. When IPM goes wrong, all fingers point to the advisor who decided not to use the pesticide. So nerves of steel and an acceptance of the many potential risks involved are crucial, where cultural or biologicals are used as the basis of all control decisions. The variables caused by IPM are many, but there are always variables in crop production. In my 35 years, I've never seen this normal year's weather they talk about. And above all other variables, the vagaries of the British weather and speed with which it can change hold sway overall. In crop production, about 80% is luck because of the weather and 20% is skill. And that 20% is reliant upon chemistry, reliable alternative options to chemistry, a willing and open mind able to adopt the skills and the mindset to trust alternative emerging technologies. You need an advisor with the skill and the ability to adapt by the hour, and crucially, you need the right weather at the right time to complement everything. So any part of that 20% gets hit is catastrophic. An alternative approach from the organic sector, fungicides and nutrition, for example, weed control and even insecticides, are already utilised as part of IPM. Today's agriculture is really a true hybrid of organic, the use of plant protection products, alongside cultural and rotational practice. And that is IPM in action, an integrated approach to growing crops. There's always been a willingness to try alternatives on farm, but the rise of dozens of snake oils and other mysterious elixirs and drenches over the last 15 years or so that have promised everything but rarely delivered has undoubtedly affected the confidence in recommending and using alternative products. Many of them still very expensive, and when they work, if they work, there's no obvious reason why or how they worked or whether they'll ever work again. And it's that historic unreliability which is now the biggest obstacle in the way of their wider adoption. And a lack of independent trials data hasn't helped. So to understand why IPM is so important, and as I've hinted already, IPM isn't something new. I've been doing this job over 35 years. Every decision I've taken is based around what we would now call IPM. But we have to understand what IPM means. It does not mean we scrap plant protection products. That would be adopting an organic system. And because of yield reductions, massive inefficiencies, and intensity of land use, that's simply not practical. Over the last decade, our awareness of underlying issues with reliance upon plant protection products alone have been addressed and faced. And there's a much greater awareness of consequences of all plant protection application in the independent advice sector, at least, when it comes to their impact. We as an industry now recognise IPM approaches as viable, trustworthy tools. And I firmly believe that the rise of independent advice, who are selling nothing but advice onto now almost half of the UK arable, is what's led to far more restraint being shown across the whole advice industry because of the comparatively lower levels of pesticide use by the independent advisors, with therefore started to see more restraint used by the others as a result. And I think IPM is a system which has full access to every tool available, each as important as one another, and most importantly, the grower and advisor need the willingness and the ability to implement that. It's inherent in me as a commercially independent agronomist with no sales targets, with nobody breathing down my neck other than my conscience, to employ plant protection products only when, if and where necessary. But to have full access to them should that need arise. To have access to biological compounds as they progress into viable alternatives alongside plant protection products, and to employ them when and where I need them too. But I need to be sure that what's available from the biological and alternative side is capable of dealing with the situation. The perspective is this: 27%, or 4,667,000 hectares of the 18.2 million hectares of agricultural land in the UK is suitable for producing arable crops. I mentioned the organic sector a minute ago. There are 498,000 hectares of organic production in the UK, of which 86%, or 430,000 hectares, is grassland. So just 68,000 hectares drop into that arable production. Organic arable, therefore, makes up less than 1.5% of UK arable production. But organic winter wheat, for example, using the same varieties that I use in conventional, yields around 70% less. All these figures are on the Soil Association website, by the way. So organic arable contributes less than 0.9% of actual crop output. And unless the biologicals evolve into viable, reliable treatments to replace conventional standards, organic is not the way forward if we want to feed people and optimise and sustainably produce output and production from that finite arable area. Food security must never be overlooked in all of this. Now, I don't believe we can farm without pesticides today. Promises are made about the capacity of many of the biologicals, but so far none have held up to be consistent. It will be possible with the evolution of varietal traits. CRISPR technology will probably speed that up, combined with 5th or 6th generation biologicals, bringing more reliability against pests and diseases. But when that's going to happen, I don't know. And if we're going to utilise that 4,667,000 hectares efficiently, and if we're going to increase our level of self-sufficiency, then all these issues need addressing very urgently. There's a reason why only 1.5% of arable is in organic production. Perhaps biologicals and biotech needs to come from the large R&D companies with all of the trusted science and trials data that plant protection products have behind them, because perhaps that would give confidence to growers and advisors to use them. Because companies who are just looking to shift volume of snake oil are not helping, because inconsistency, too many promises made and broken, and too many poor or negative results are their biggest problem. Growers will always use something that works. They'll never use it again if it doesn't. So IPM today is a necessity, and I think it's far more broadly adopted than perhaps many realise. I mentioned blackgrass a little bit earlier on. Today, without the use of IPM, cultural adoption, alongside glyphosate, we cannot manage blackgrass. And incidentally, if we wish to keep regenerative agriculture, minimum tillage, low tillage, no tillage, controlled traffic, non-inversion technology, glyphosate will be absolutely key in all of that. But we have to combine all approaches to the best of our ability. And this is IPM, and all the options, as I say, are as vital as each other. Can we do without glyphosate? Today there is no alternative which is as safe or reliable. I've no doubt it'll come, but it's not here yet. Can we reduce the levels of insecticide and pesticide use going forward? Undoubtedly. You start by detaching the advice from the sales. Can we do all of that and reduce the currently independently advised levels of input by IPM alone? Not without a sea change of CRISPR and other gene editing technology in varietal traits in particular, or more reliably effective biologicals to render fungicides and other pesticides redundant. Peer-to-peer knowledge transfer from events like today is going to help in IPM adoption with reductions in usage and all of that. But farmers need to be able to trust their advisor. We're already doing these things. Cabbage stem flea beetle, for example, in oilseed rape, all now, but the damage done to the predators and the beneficials has become counterproductive. More helpful then to allow the natural predators to build by utilising cultural control, removing the ineffective insecticides, managing the drilling date, using vigorous varieties, companion crops, longer stubbles, organic manures, digestate, and understanding what the impact of the previous season's weather had on the cabbage stem flea beetle population in the first place before you put it in the ground. I haven't treated pollen beetle for over 25 years now in rape, and the damage is minimal because by building the natural predators, the treatment thresholds are rarely reached, and they're just as important as pollinators, more so than their damage as pests. And no insecticide in oilseed rape is only going to encourage beneficials to come into their own. 80% of insect life in a rape canopy is a beneficial. Pyrethroids do still give some control against BYDV vectors, but I believe insecticides are now largely a waste of time in cereals. So by delaying your drilling and allowing the tens of thousands of money spiders, along with the other aphid predators, to predate on all of these aphids once the 170 growing day degrees have reached in the autumn, my fields shine silver from money spider silk throughout autumn. I haven't seen BYDV for over 20 years because of that approach. I haven't used pyrethroids for BYDV in spring cereals for over 20 years, and I haven't seen an increase in barley yellow dwarf virus in that time. For every pest, there's a predator. We have to let them build and predate. SFI, of course, now provides designated homes for our beneficials, pollinators, but that's also a home for weeds, pests and diseases, and cabbage stem flea beetle, pea moth, bruchid beetle, pea and bean weevil, all manner of aphids and many, many species of diseases are going to find host plants in those mixes. But that's just another part of the IPM conundrum we have to solve. Pea moth, of course, can be devastating to peas in a bad year. So IPM-based pheromone traps help us restrict insecticide use to the worst year. Bruchid beetle as well. We often see greater level of bruchid damage in treated than we do in untreated crops because the predators are flourishing. Sugar beet and potatoes are a bit more complicated from an insecticide and virus point of view. But plant breeding programs, varietal traits, evolving biologicals should help to change that over the next few years. So it's a mindset. And IPM will never work without every tool being available, including the pesticides that I use on a daily basis, and which are crucial to crop production. Combined IPM, cultural and pesticide use is still the only way to deal with most weeds and diseases. Will we ever get away from using herbicides? I can't see that until reliable, effective alternatives develop. As varietal traits improve, fungicide use will definitely fall, and some varieties are getting there now, but we're not there yet. And don't forget, the weeds, pests and diseases are all adapting far more quickly than we are. So the main message is that IPM is far more than just filling in an online form once a year on the NFU site and telling people, by doing that, I do IPM. IPM has to become part of daily business. It is, whether you realise it or not, the basis of today's farms, but it's the future of tomorrow's farming. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you can see the broader mindset of integrated pest management is definitely there, alive and well, and pretty much in place, certainly in the independent advice sector, but across our industry. I can only speak for the independent, but we just have to convince the wider industry to go much further. So I hope you find this conference as useful and as informative as we've all tried to make it. So thank you very much for listening. I'll take questions through the day or whenever you want to ask them, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean. That was a fantastic introduction to the day. I know we're running a bit late, but if there is a burning question, I can see.
I thought we might get one from Hazel.
There's a microphone if you wait for a moment.
Thank you. I'm Hazel Doonan. I work for the Agricultural Industries Confederation, and I represent 1,200 plus agronomists who are basis qualified and who take IPM training. Sean, you talk for the fee-paid sector. I talk for the sector that are employed by distributors. There is no evidence following analysis of IPM plans to show that farmers who take advice from distributor agronomists practice IPM to any lesser extent than those who take advice from fee-paid agronomists. Our members undertake trials, independent trials. They spend £11 million per annum, and they demonstrate not product necessarily effectiveness, but they're looking at ways to control resistant blackgrass using cultivations, using spring cropping, using cover crops. And farmers come along to those trials. We had 11,000 farmers come along to those trials on an annual basis, 200 stakeholders, to see what works and what doesn't work. There are no chemicals involved in those trials. Nobody's trying to sell anything to anybody other than good advice. And you know, Sean, and I know, that farmers judge the value of agronomists by what they add to their farm business. If they're adding value, they're an asset. If they're adding cost, they're not an asset to that business. And there's a lot of competitiveness out there. There's a lot of agronomists. There's 3,500 on the basis professional register that farmers can choose from. So they're at will to choose whoever they would like to give them their advice. So I don't see that there's any issue between distributor agronomists and agronomists that are fee paid. And I think we all have to work together, because if we say there's a difference in the quality of advice, we are undermining the basis professional register. And if we feel that needs addressing, we should do that collectively. I could go on, but I won't, because I appreciate there is a lot of things to cover today. So thank you.
So the question is, which is why, Hazel, I said at the beginning that the mindset of the individual is far more important than whether you're independent or not. And I stated that at the beginning, and I totally agree with you.
Thank you. I think today is really about challenging these mindsets and getting this discussion. So thank you very much, Hazel. Hopefully we'll dig into this as the day goes on as well. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the first session. The first session is looking really at what happened last year, a moment kind of reflection of what the challenges were, what the highlights and opportunities were. So our first speaker is Julie Smith. She's a principal consultant in plant pathology at ADAS with 25 years experience in applied crop protection. With extensive experience in integrated management of cereal diseases, Julie currently leads the Defra funded survey of crop pests and diseases. Julie, over to you.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Morning, everybody. So I've been asked today to give an update about the Pest and Disease Survey, to explain why it's important for IPM, and to just set the scene a little bit and explain what happened to summarise the 2023-24 season in terms of arable crops. So the Pest and Disease Survey, it's a long-standing piece of work, and the objective really is to collect pest and disease information, pest and disease levels from commercial farms across England and Wales, and to make that data and its findings accessible and useful to a whole variety of stakeholders. So I'm not going to go too much into the methodology, but we are monitoring approximately 300 commercial fields of winter wheat and approximately 90 commercial fields of winter oilseed rape each year. We make assessments during key growth stages of the crop, and as I said, we collect information about disease levels and pests, including natural enemies and beneficials. So the farms that we survey, they take part voluntarily. We have a stratification underpinning the survey. So the number of fields that we survey in each region is directly proportional to the acreage of crop grown in that region. So it should be truly representative of the industry. And as well as collecting information about pest and disease levels, we also collect information about agronomic practice, so things like the variety that was sown, the sowing date, the tillage practice, rotational history of the field, and also about all of the pesticide inputs to that field. So I think this is a really valuable piece of work, because when you think about it, there are lots of projects, lots of research goes on to tell us what the best IPM practice should be and to suggest what we might do, but there are very few pieces of work that actually look to see what is going on real farms. And when you put those data together, you can start unpicking the implications of certain trends in agronomic practice choices. So, for example, if we see trends in a shift in sowing date, we can interrogate the data and look to see whether that is having an impact on pest and disease levels. So our project, the survey, is guided by stakeholders. We have a proper steering committee on which AICC sit on. We have a wider, diverse stakeholder group, and we do lots of outreach activities like this. And we really do welcome feedback. So if anybody wants to speak to me afterwards about this, we really, really do want to engage with all of our different stakeholders about this. So in terms of the data coming out of the survey, I'll sort of explain a little bit later. We have some budget in the project to interrogate this data and to ask really quite interesting questions of the data. So the questions are posed by our stakeholders. They're then put to steering committee for a vote, and we then carry out analysis on some of the questions that were deemed to be important. So just to highlight a few of the questions, we were asked a very interesting question as to whether we believe that whether there is evidence that growers are actually adjusting fungicide programs in accordance to the resistance of the variety that's being sown, and whether there's scope to adjust programs, and whether there's evidence that that's happening. And I think Rosie's going to touch on this a little bit later. I don't have time to go into this analysis. But one of the interesting things that's come out of this is that using the historical data, so real data from real commercial farms where people are using a whole range of different pesticide inputs, we can see that the evidence shows that there is scope to further adjust our fungicide inputs in accordance to the variety being grown, but the data also shows that this isn't necessarily being done to the extent that it could be done. Okay, so I'm not saying that people aren't using IPM and they're not doing it, but the evidence suggests that there is scope to adjust things further. Okay, we've got 3 manuscripts in preparation, so that'll be coming out hopefully through peer-reviewed papers in the not too distant future. So I'm going to just summarise a little bit the 2024 season. So we'll start with oilseed rape. Now, I mean, it's tough. Anybody growing oilseed rape this year, you know, it's been tough. So really the 2023-24 season, I think the key disease was canker, which that sort of came out of the survey data. So when I'm talking about canker, Phoma canker, I'm talking about the A-type, Phoma A-type, that causes these true canker lesions, not the B-type that causes stem lesions higher up. So if we look at data then taken from the survey, we're showing the data. We have 3 different metrics for the data. We have crop incidence. So this is a percentage of surveyed crops that have been affected by a disease. We've got plant incidence, which I'm not showing here. So plant incidence is the percentage of plants within a crop that are affected, and that's important for things like FOMA because it triggers spray thresholds. So when you've got 20% plants infected, you would apply a spray. And we're also looking at severity. So from previous research and from peer-reviewed literature, we know that when canker severity reaches about 25%, there's quite a significant impact on yield, okay? So what we can see straight away then, if you look at the disease severity for the 2023-24 season, which is over here, we can see that it's quite high. So we've had 2 really quite intense FOMA years. If we break that down to a regional level, so we've got the 8 English regions plus Wales across the bottom. So we've got the East, East Midlands, North East, North West, South East, South West, Wales, West Midlands, Yorkshire and the Humber. We can see that it's not so much a problem in the north, which is quite common really, or it certainly wasn't in 2024. But there are certain regions where, as a regional mean, we were above that 25% threshold, so people would have been experiencing quite a significant impact on yield from FOMA canker. So why has it been? Why have we had 2 high FOMA years? Well, we know that to get high canker, you need about 21 days of rain for the pseudothecia to mature, to be able to release ascospores. FOMA's monocyclic, so you'll get ascospore release over that winter period. You need about 21 days of rain. Well, we've certainly had wet August and Septembers, and that threshold was reached quite quickly in the last 2 years. We know that early epidemics on small backward crops are the most damaging to yield, and again, we've certainly seen that. We've seen leaf spots as early as sort of mid-October in these previous 2 years. There is evidence to suggest that conventionals are a little bit more susceptible than hybrids. And again, we have the variety information, we can interrogate it. I'm not showing it here in this presentation. We've had a lot of delayed sprays because it's been so wet and difficult to get onto fields. And I think there's generally been a little bit less investment in oilseed rape because people are just so a little bit despondent about it perhaps. And we've seen that come through in terms of fewer applications and also cheaper products. So if we look just to really sort of hammer home this impact of early and late epidemics, because this affects, as I said, sowing date. We know that small backward crops, when the epidemic strikes, if your crop is quite small and backwards, it's going to have a bigger impact on yield. If we take a fairly low FOMA year, so 2019, this is a very typical shape of a FOMA epidemic. You get ascospores released, you get an initial peak in the number of plants affected in a field. We then see those lower leaves dropping off, dying off, so diseases go down, and then we get a secondary release of spores, which in a standard year usually is anywhere from 4 to 10 weeks after the first peak. So this was 2019 when we had low to moderate canker levels. If we then compare that with last year, I mean, we start monitoring, we have weekly monitoring stations. We started monitoring on the 1st of October, and we were already at, over 80% of plants in the crop were affected. So the epidemic was so early, I think a lot of people potentially could have just missed that application timing. So as I said, this sort of threshold of 10 to 20% plants infected to trigger a thrace threshold. So you can see how the whole epidemic was just shifted forward. So it's been a really tough year for growing rape. So in terms of what can we do, IPM approaches, well, don't plant next to unploughed stubbles because we know it's ascospore induced. Don't delay sowing, and I do realise this is difficult because there are other challenges on the farm that might make you want to do that. The early epidemics are most damaging to yield. There are some pretty good forecasts out there and guides as to when plants are likely to reach that 10 to 20% threshold. And we do know that, well, you know, generally speaking, if you can get 2 applications on, the AHDB fungicide performance data shows us that generally speaking, 2 applications of a half rate will do a good job if you can get them on at the right time. So if you're growing variety of sort of a 7 or less, then you want to be applying that first application when 10 to 20% of plants in your crop are infected, a little bit higher if you're growing a more resistant variety. So you really need to get out and monitor those crops. It's not triggered particularly by calendar date. So as I said, I realise there are lots of competing challenges for people growing. I've tried to summarise just the disease challenges, let alone things like pests and cabbage stem flea beetle. And I think the big competing diseases like leaf spot. So in terms of IPM, if you have like leaf spot challenges, you would want to sow your crop a little bit later. Whereas if you think canker pressure is the big one on your farm, you would want to sow your crop a little bit earlier. So I'm going to move quickly on to wheat, have a little look at the wheat situation last year. So I've got a box whisker chart here, and this is quite nice. This allows us to compare the 2024 mean, national mean level, with the previous 20-year mean in a simple snapshot. So the boxes represent the expected range of the data. This is crop incidence, so this is the percentage of crops affected by a disease, and the black dots at the top of each bar here represent the 2024 levels. So we can see in a snapshot that we had quite a lot of septoria, which everybody knows about, but we also had a brown rust epidemic last year here. So in a similar theme to what we've just looked at for the rape, we'll just focus on brown rust. The last brown rust epidemic was really 2007. So I've got here the data, the national level data. The dark brown bars represent leaf 1, so the bars on the left, and the bars next to them, slightly lighter brown, represent leaf 2. So you can see that in 2024, it wasn't quite as bad as the 2007 epidemic in terms of the number of crops that showed brown rust symptoms. And really pleasingly, when you look at the actual severity, we had managed to control it reasonably well. So the actual severity of disease, so the percentage of leaf area affected by active brown rust, was lower than 2007. So again, we'll just have a look at the regional breakdown. This comes as no surprise. We know that brown rust really is a disease of the East particularly, and that comes out quite clearly, I think, in the regional breakdown. So why did we have a brown rust epidemic last year? Well, if you look at the adapted model from Johnson, we can see that the latent period of brown rust is shortened for each approximately 1.5 days increase, by 1.5 days for each degree increase in temperature. So the graph here shows, the dotted line shows the 30-year mean temperature. This is data taken from the east. The dark blue line shows the 2007 epidemic, and the light blue line shows the 2024 epidemic. And we can see quite clearly that in both of these high epidemic years, the temperature, the mean temperature, was a lot higher than the 30-year mean. So we would have had shorter latent periods, which would have meant faster cycling of the disease. We also know that we had a lack of winter frosts, so the lower leaves that harbour infection might not have been killed off. And again, because it was so difficult to get onto fields, it was such a wet, horrible season, I think there were quite a lot of sort of delayed or missed T0, T1 applications. And we can see that again from the data we collect in the survey. And interestingly, it should be pointed out that 82% of the varieties on the recommended list are a 6 or below, so really moderately, susceptible to brown rust. I just want to mention ergot. Now, it's difficult for us to capture ergot in the survey because our timing of disease assessment is a little bit too early to truly capture ergot levels. We are in discussion with Defra about what we might do to address this. So this, for me, ergot, we see it as a disease of increasing importance. It seems to be rising. So we don't have any fungicide options to control ergot. So this is a true IPM problem, I think. We know that the open pollinated flowering type, open flowering habit varieties are more susceptible to it. Varieties with a longer flowering period are more susceptible because it's conducive for infection to occur. So uneven crop establishment, lots of late secondary tillering are going to be risk factors. We know that it likes cool, wet conditions during flowering. Well, we've had that, you know, the miserable summer that we've just had. Things like poor grass weed control, particularly blackgrass, but not only blackgrass contributes. Things like non-inversion tillage, which of course is much more popular now than it was sort of, 30 years ago, is also a contributing factor because the ergots, they survive about a year in the soil, on the surface. And also, we don't know what the impact of the new SFI schemes are going to be. But I do think that the survey data will help us to address that question in due course. So in terms of data accessibility, we've made all of the historical data accessible. So we have a website for the survey, and it's pestanddiseasesurvey.co.uk. So this is if you go to the Explore the Data tab, there's then an option to launch the platform. So this is the home page of the platform. You can then choose what you want to see. We've got wheat data, oilseed rape data, and variety information. So if we just look at wheat data, for example, we've made all of the data accessible going back to 1970. We're just on septoria leaf blotch severity here. So it's really quite nice to be able to pick out the epidemic years. We've got the three different metrics for you to look at. We've got crop incidence, plant incidence, and severity, as we discussed earlier. There are some filters as well that you can play with if you want to look at the impact of things like sowing date and variety and so forth. We have the same for oilseed rape. Oilseed rape data goes back to 1982, so not quite as long term, but still a really decent data set. Now, we've also got some information on varieties, which I find is quite fun. It's quite nostalgic to go and see the old varieties. So if we look at wheat, I've just arbitrarily picked 1975, and it appears that Maris Huntsman was the variety of choice for anybody old enough to remember that. If you want to download the data, you can do so. Obviously, the data are completely non-disclosive. These data are either mean national level data or mean regional level data. You don't need an account, or you don't have to log in to use this. You can just go and log it. We don't track IP addresses or anything like that. So if you go to the What Data Are Available page, you can simply download the time series as simple Excel spreadsheets and go and do whatever you want with it. So we do also have pest data as part of this survey. We are very aware of the urgent need to make this accessible too, and we are working on it. So hopefully that will come in the not too distant future. So I think in terms of acknowledgements, I would just like to say a huge thank you to all of the farmers that very kindly allow us to survey their fields. It just wouldn't work without them, and it's such an important piece of work, hopefully for everybody's benefit. And we should also remember the late Judith Turner of Ferrer, who has also had a huge input into the surveys over the years. Do you want questions, or are you?
We'll save all the questions to the end, if that's all right. So thank you very much, Julie. We will have opportunities for questions at the end of the session, but we'll go straight on now to the next speaker, who is Rosemary Collier, whose main interest is in development and application of IPM strategies in horticultural crops. She's a professor at the University of Warwick, and she has spearheaded IPM in horticulture, for which she has awarded an OBE earlier this year, recognising her significant impact in the UK. Thank you very much, Rosemary.
Okay, right. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for asking me to speak. So I'm sort of talking about things, well, crops, I think a different order of magnitude to the crops that probably you're going to focus on today. So quite a challenge to actually just cover the topic apart from anything else. So I'm not really going to talk about what happened in 2024, but I'm just going to talk about, you know, where we are, where we think we are now, and where we think we might be going in the future. So, as I said, the thing about horticulture is it's probably well over 100 crops, grown in a diversity of growing environments. They're all classified as minor crops, and they have a small footprint. So I guess in terms of environmental impact in one way, they do not have such a large adverse effect. So I thought I'd just run through, first of all, the kind of four main challenges. There are lots of challenges, but just pick out the key ones. So the first challenge, which all horticultural growers have to aim for, is having a high yield of high quality produce. And anybody who's been into one of the major supermarkets will realise what a challenge that is to produce that, you know, perfect produce, uniform in size as well. And that, you know, there's a study here, Pimentel, quite an old study, often requires more inputs than if you could get away with a few blemishes. The second challenge, and I think that's sort of emphasised because they're minor crops, is the loss of synthetic insecticides. So while I agree that pesticides are certainly part of IPM, I can see that they're disappearing quite rapidly. This is just one example, which was the most recent pesticide usage survey report, and this is leafy brassicas. And you can see that the three main insecticides that are being used by growers to control pest insects are all in a dicey position. So one's going soon, one's going in the EU, and we don't quite know what the future is in the UK. And then the other one, which is lambda-cyhalothrin, there are resistances in a number of species to pyrethroids and species that infest brassica crops. The next challenge, which sort of follows on from that, is not only is there a lack of pesticidal tools, but there's also generally a lack of tools. And when you look at, well, the diversity of crops, but also for some of the crops, the diversity of pests and pathogens that could potentially infest them. And Stan Finch, my boss in the old days, he estimated there were potentially 49 pest insects of brassica crops. So, you know, we don't have tools to manage all of those, pesticidal or otherwise. And the fourth challenge, which I think Sean has alluded to, is basically that there is a perception that amongst growers and members of the industry that IPM is risky. Sean's explained some of the reasons why. These, you don't have to read them in detail, but these are just some quotes from a study that we did at Warwick, led by Alex Kelly. So what I'm going to do for the rest of my slot is just do a bit of a sector review. And for that, I thought I'd take a slightly different approach and ask colleagues from four sort of major companies that support growers where they thought they were now and when they thought they were going, where they thought they were going. So I asked them each for a couple of slides, and as ever, you get too much information. But I thought I've kept the information in, but I'm just going to headline, but happy. I mean, there's loads of stuff in there. I'm happy to talk about it later. So first of all, protected crops. I think everybody would agree that IPM is most highly developed in protected crops and particularly in greenhouse crops. They're high value crops. That means the growers can actually invest in IPM. They're contained environment. They're controlled, so controlled conditions. And there is sort of pressure to use biological control, partly to protect pollinators where they're used for crops such as tomato, and also because of the development of pesticide resistance. And so there has been for quite a while biological control with invertebrates and some biopesticides. That doesn't mean that they won't come in from time to time with synthetic products when needed. So the first person I asked was Liam Harvey from BioBest, and he basically gave me a lot of information about the technology that's being developed, and it is truly amazing. And obviously this is a period now when technology and AI are moving things forward at a pace. So systems for monitoring pests and I guess also pathogens, automated systems, software to support that, in some cases to identify pests, and then application technologies. So technologies where if you're applying beneficial invertebrates, then you can spread them through the crop more easily. I mean, the other thing about, greenhouses is that they're sort of permanent structures, and they've got a framework, and that framework you can fit in things like robotics or whatever. It's quite easy to do that. And then in terms of what's coming, he mentioned biotremology, which I had to look up, which is basically about vibration and how pests respond to vibration in the crop and from other things. A lot more development of decision support systems, providing IPM as a service. So he's talking there about the company providing a service, and then further integration of products and technology. So integrating information all the time, because all of this is really sort of information heavy. And in the longer term, he mentioned bioacoustics. The approach that I'm aware of here is that you can identify some species, for example, flies or moths by their wing beat frequency, and also widespread automation, so basically plant factories. And yeah, that's coming along anyway in greenhouses in all sorts of ways, but also that IPM will also be a much more automated. I then asked colleagues from Fargrow, which is a UK company supporting growers of protected crops, and their focus at the moment is what they call holistic growing. So basically working on feeding plants in the most appropriate way, so that they are very healthy, and they're less vulnerable to pests and diseases. And that may be, I think it's probably easier with plants that are grown in a soil or similar medium, potentially less so when they're grown in a nutrient solution, but not impossible. And so the idea, yes, is that you have healthy plants, and then that means that when you have to introduce either macrobiologicals or biopesticides, that they're more effective in what they do. And so the holistic growing approach involves, again, a lot of monitoring, so monitoring nutrient content in different points in the system. And again, it involves technology, so a range of sensors so that you can measure a whole range of different things at different points in the greenhouse. And I think one of the things about greenhouses, again, is that you can, because of the system, because of the investment, you can actually sort of put sensors throughout the greenhouse in that framework and really get a good picture of what's going on. Then going on to top fruit. So again, there is a bit of structure and a bit of permanence in top fruit, which allows growers to, for example, establish populations of natural enemies over time. I asked Jonathan Blackman from Hutchinson's, and he listed again a few of the approaches that are being used at the moment. So obviously different approaches to pest monitoring, some of which is now automated. There is the potential for mating disruption that was available in the UK. This is for codling moth, but it's been commercially withdrawn at the moment. Granulosis virus for Lepidoptera. And also they and others are working on variable rate spraying, which at the moment is in the development phase. And he flagged up one project that they're involved in at the moment, which I think is an Innovate project. And the thing on the left is a variable rate sprayer that's under development. So basically what they're attempting to do is to treat, if you like, trees on an individual basis, well, either individual trees or parts of orchards on an individual basis. And then we move on to soft fruit. So I guess less permanence, but still quite often a bit of confinement protection, because quite a few of them are grown in polytunnels. Good use of biological control with invertebrates, trapping for various pest insects. Some growers use banker plants to build up natural enemy populations. BTs quite widely used for Lepidoptera. Work again on imaging for scouting. And really interesting to me is that there is development of use of the sterile insect technique for spotted wing Drosophila, and they're being sterilised with X-rays. And there are, through this company, Big Sis, widespread commercial trials in the UK. And then, just to go on to disease a bit, then UV robots are being used for powdery mildew control in strawberries, and with any luck, I don't know whether it's going to work, but basically, yeah, here we go. So there are these. Just to go on to disease a bit, then UV robots. Interesting. How did that happen? Anyway, I can show you the video later. There are robots that move into the greenhouses or the polytunnels at night and expose the crops to UV light. And finally on to field vegetables and salads, which is my area. So I think these are not very permanent crops at all. So it's sometimes quite hard to set up a structure as you might do to bring in natural enemies or whatever. They're often on rented land, so you can't actually control what's happened before. And they're highly affected by surrounding crops, including arable crops. And I think that's particularly the impact of oilseed rape and sugar beet to a certain extent as well, in terms of pests and pathogens. So already across a diversity of crops there are uses of different tools in different parts of the IPM pyramid. For example, physical barriers, crop covers, nets have been used for a long time on certain root crops where there were no insecticidal treatments available. Obviously monitoring, forecasting. Some instances of host plant resistance, but some of those have broken down, so the pests have overcome them. Crop rotation is a good basis, and I'm aware that some growers still don't practice that as they should for other reasons. And then in terms of the future, basically, I think some of that hopefully will include learning from practices in protected and other crops. I think there'll be more of an emphasis on biopesticides, biostimulants in the future. Obviously, potential for precision farming, sort of things that are going on in fruit and greenhouses, smart monitoring of pests and pathogens, and an interest in what role there is for increasing plant species diversity in crops. So things like companion planting or bringing in beneficial insects. And I've been talking to colleagues in the rest of Europe recently, and there is great interest in that area. And then the one thing I think is so important, which applies to all crops, is actually we need to be making the crop plants do more work. And so we need to have more crop plants that have traits for pest and disease resistance. And in the UK, we're very lucky that Defra funds the Veggin project, the Vegetable Genetic Improvement Network, and the aim of that is to look for those sort of traits in vegetable crops. It's led by Warwick with Harper Adams. And if when we identify those traits, then we pass them on to seed companies who will then develop them into commercial varieties. So final thoughts, sort of bring it all together. So again, small footprint, high value, at least protected crops, very high value. You could say that horticulture is a good case for sustainable intensification. The crop and system diversity and the fact that they're all minor crops is still a problem for resources, research and registration. You'll see from what I've summarised, there's an increasing focus on plant health, and then precision monitoring and precision treatment. Breeding for sustainability traits will be key. Agri-tech, lots of potential there, leading to new opportunities. Definitely more scope for biologicals, but we need to understand how to use them better, and more scope for plant species diversity within crops. And I think, there's a lot of techie research going on at the moment, and which is brilliant, and you can see what it's leading to. But we still need basic biological research on pest, pathogen and weed biology. And I do wonder how that's going to be resourced in future. So I'll stop there. Thank you to the four teams who provided the information. Again, thank you for asking me to speak. Thank you to my colleagues and collaborators. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. I think it's really interesting to see not just the diversity of challenges, but also some similarities across different sectors. So really, really good to have a diversity of speakers today. Our next speaker is Lynn Tatnell, who's a principal weed research scientist at ADAS, and she leads our weed research team. Her key interest includes integrated weed management in multiple cropping systems, with an understanding of the biology and the ecology of annual and perennial weed species. She has also previously worked on a number of herbicide-resistant projects, including many that were Defra Link or industry funded. So I'll pass over to Lynn, give us an update on where we are with weeds.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, good morning, everybody. So I think my challenge this morning is to get through this in 20 minutes if I'm doing the whole of weed management, so I will give it a go. So I wanted to kind of start with thinking about what our challenges are, and I don't want these to be negative. I was just trying to put these into different categories of how I think we can break these up. So thinking about pesticides and the use of pesticides for weed control, we've obviously got issues like increasing resistance. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Grass weeds remain our biggest challenge. We've got probably over-reliance on the few actives we have and very few new actives coming through. So say we've heard about that from others this morning. Farming system changes, I think, is a really big thing, and this is something that really will have a massive impact on weed management going forward. So thinking about regen ag, really high interest in that now. We're all seeing a lot of changes and a lot of excitement over how that's going to change our farming systems going forward. the SFI payments, we're going to hear about those today, but that has a big impact on weeds and new weeds coming in as species. Cover crop use, very exciting, very diverse, but again, weeds could become a problem within that, and we need to think about management of those, and things like decreased tillage and wider rotation, so I'll touch on those in a moment. But the big, wider environmental issues as well. We've got to think about our carbon, we've got to think about the overall soil health on our farms, and overall pesticide reduction. So we are thinking about how we can be more sustainable going forward. So this is a lot of things, and obviously I can't do all of this in 20 minutes, but I'm going to try. So I wanted to start with resistance. It's a really big area for all pest, weed and diseases. So over the last 40 years, we have done a lot of research, and we know a lot about the species that are now resistant, particularly our grass weeds. So starting with blackgrass, I think I need to start with blackgrass. Most of you will be very familiar with that. There is a paper that was published last year. Myself and Richard here today are two of those authors, and we've tried to summarise all the resistance testing we've had over the last 35 years into this paper, and we put the Pesticide data and other data on agronomy with that. So please, if you get a chance to have a look at this paper, it really does help to summarise where we were with resistance, or where we are with resistance, and how we've used resistance testing as a tool to help us manage this. So I can't talk a lot about that now, but just a couple of highlights from that. Thinking about blackgrass, obviously back in the 1980s, we knew resistance was becoming a problem. We had one or two isolated populations there, the darker colours on this map, but they were just to maybe one active. Now we're talking about multiple farms all across the UK, the lighter colours there, right up into, we're getting samples from the Scottish borders, over in the west, and most of these are resistant to multiple modes of action. So unfortunately, it still is increasing. So we start with the grass weeds. We now have resistance, as everybody probably knows in this room, to blackgrass, Italian ryegrass, wild oats and bromes. So I've just put the groups on there, the HRAC groups that we follow. So they're now group 1, 2, 3 and 15. But also we now do have confirmed resistance to group 9. So I will now talk about that in a bit more detail. Some of you may be aware of this, it's obviously just been announced this year. We've had a joint industry coming together of this through the Weed Resistance Action Group, and through my colleague John Cousins, who was at NIAB, who's now with us at ADAS, and sampling we've done over the last couple of years, we've been able to actually confirm that this population is resistant. So it was based down in Kent. It was from plants that were surviving what we call an appropriate dose. It was applied at the right dose in a spring crop before planting, but there were lots of survivors. They were then taken and tested, and we can confirm this is a field case of glyphosate resistance. So this is the first glyphosate-resistant grassweed, unfortunately, that we now have in the UK. So just to show you what that looks like in a greenhouse scenario, so this was testing that was done at NIAB last year, but you can see we have 450 grams of 1.5 litres a hectare and up to 4 litres a hectare. The top line is the resistant population, so you can see how it's surviving very high rates of glyphosate. But just to put that into a bit of context, so sorry, this graph is a little bit busy, so I don't expect you to take the detail from the graph behind, but it's really to give you an example of how we're actually monitoring this from a scientific point of view. So we've actually been looking at ryegrass over a number of years. It's I'd say, an increasing problem. We get a lot more samples in for resistance testing. So again, through work that's done at NIAB and ADAS, we've collated those data to produce the graph behind me that's very busy. But you can see a little bit of variation in that, but really not very much. So we always get samples that are slightly more tolerant to modes of action than others. And these were all then screened against glyphosate. And that's over 300 samples. And you can see really we are not getting a problem. So I will say from this that no issues were identified in this mass screening of lots and lots of samples. So I just wanted to put the whole resistance issue into a bit of context so people are understanding where we are. So it's not a big epidemic. But what we do need to do with this, obviously, is take it very seriously. So for this spring, we are offering this rapid testing of samples. So this, again, coordinated through the RAG. Please go to their website for details of how you can take samples. And this is all coordinated as well through Bayer agronomists. So they should be your first point of call. The results will be reported back quickly because, again, it's really useful. People need this information urgently. And there will be a national summary on this. So people won't be picked out. We won't be saying, well, there's new cases in Cambridgeshire, what have you. It will be summarised as a national report. But this really is a first step. We have got to take this extremely seriously, and we are very concerned about this, and we'll be managing and monitoring it. So I'm going to leave resistance there for the grass weeds, move on to broadleaf weeds, much prettier weeds. So we know we have confirmed cases of resistance in poppy, chickweed and mayweed. They're all to our ALS group 2 herbicides. We have had a case of groundsel to group 5 a long, long time ago. That was an isolated situation, but I have put it on there because it is reported as a resistant case. We are, however, very concerned about resistance in broadleaf weeds because we're seeing a lot of use of ALS products across the whole rotation. So this is a big concern if you're using herbicide-tolerant crops in oilseed rape, in sugar beet. We are able to use ALSs in every part of our cereal rotation and wider rotation. So this is something, again, as an industry, we need to be really concerned about and monitor very closely. And then we need to maintain the other actives we have. So we've got choices. We've got the phenoxies, we've got haloxafen range, and these are actives we now really, really need to keep and maintain for being able to manage these weeds for the future. But we're always getting new species for testing. So I just spoke to my colleagues that are testing this year, and we've had cleavers for the first time. Cranesbill, I've never tested cranesbill for resistance testing. Redshank. So these may not be resistant, but they're starting to come through as populations we've never ever had inquiries about or tested before. Groundsel, we have done a lot of work with that species now, and again, south thistle, we have actually found some ALS resistant cases. So you can see, again, putting it into context, not huge numbers, but each year now they're increasing. We're up to 16 different samples this year, and probably 5 years ago, we barely did any broadleaf weed testing. So again, alarm bells are ringing. So I'm leaving resistance behind. We're going to jump quickly through to changing farming practices. So thinking about regenerative agriculture, I think the principles of regen ag are very familiar to everybody. So thinking about keeping your soil covered, less disturbance, crop diversity, bringing in livestock, and maintaining living roots all year round. So thinking about some of those principles, there are a lot of things that will have an effect on your weed population. So for me, keeping the soil covered, having the diversity of crops is all really great for weed suppression and competition, and hopefully stopping things going to seed or germinating in the first place. But if we're doing less soil disturbance, we might be allowing the biennials to creep in, the perennials to take hold. So we've got to think about what we're doing with the populations that are in your soil or your seed bank. And again, bringing livestock in, we'll probably have herbal lays or longer term lays, could be absolutely brilliant for suppressing grass weeds in your seed bank, but they may start to bring in other species. So this is not necessarily a problem, it should be a good thing. A lot of this is a good thing, but we really need to be aware of how these changes are affecting our weed biology. So summarising those again in a very short amount of time, but thinking about regen ag, we're probably coming away from the plough. A lot of people don't want to plough, and that's for their soil health decisions, and that's, again, brilliant. But in some situations, the plough is still a really useful tool, so certainly if you have a high grass weed burden. But it's really about knowing your weeds, knowing your fields, knowing your seed bank in particular, and thinking about a starting point. So where have you come into this transition? If you're going into, if we call it regen ag or whatever term you give it, thinking about where you are, what your weeds are doing, and how bad your system or how good your system is, and how you can keep management of that with less herbicide input. We may be having more reliance on glyphosate in these systems, so it is a concern. If we're ploughing less and we're doing all this minimum tillage, we do need glyphosate as a tool. It's a brilliant tool for that. So then we need to think about what we're doing with that glyphosate, how we're using it, and using it widely. Things like mechanical weeding, again, it's a tool we've used for years, it's a brilliant tool, but it does move the soil. We do then get weed flushes from that, so think about when you're using it, how you're using it, and what your soil conditions are like when you're using it, because it can mean more weeds will then come and germinate in those situations. And one thing, again, I can't go in a lot of detail today, but I'm thinking about climate change in the future. Are we going to see more perennial crops? We're already seeing an increase in, so agroforestry isn't really a perennial crop, but it's starting to head that way. We may get more vineyards, more orchards, and that's where we probably will be using more things like glyphosate. So we really do need to think about how we're adapting our weed management to changing climate. And as Sean said earlier, we haven't had a normal year for a very long time. I don't think they exist. So we do see problems with herbicide applications not being able to go on, and then we're not targeting those weeds at the right time. So it may not be resistance issues. It may just be that the efficacy of that product didn't work because we didn't get it on at the right time for the weed growth stage. So as I said earlier, thinking about biennials coming in, perennials being a problem for the future, and this particularly in horticultural systems as well. And it's all about understanding your weed biology and thinking about how you can control your systems. So I'm just going to throw this out there as a discussion point, hopefully for later, but brome species, this is one of quite importance to us. We're seeing resistance issues in brome, but we're also quite concerned about brome creeping in. It's very good at creeping in from the margins. It lurks there, hides there, it'll be hidden, you won't see it, but it's setting seed and it's coming in and changing cultivation practices, or is allowing it to slowly walk its way into your crops. And I think anyone who has changed to a reduced tillage situation probably has now a increase in brome in the crop, and there's obviously different species of brome as well. So this is something that I think could be an issue for the future, and hopefully we can have a good discussion about this afternoon. So we'll come back to glyphosate for a minute, and I've just taken these data from the PEST reports, and this is just showing use in cereal crops, and this is a 30-year increase. So it's not for scaremongering, it's not for any concern, but I think this is just really interesting data to understand what we're doing and how we're using this within our crops. So you can see there, massive increase in usage over the last kind of 10, 15 years. From these data, it doesn't pick out whether that's pre-em, like a stale seedbed, or whether it's used for desiccant. So I can't distinguish that from the data. But I think this is just really interesting to see. But I don't think this should be seen as a negative thing, because if we're using this glyphosate well, and we're doing those stale seedbeds, and we're getting really good control at a good rate for the weed target, then this is good. This could be something, it's a tool we're using, and we need this tool, but it's just showing you how reliant we are on this tool within our cereal production systems. And there's 2 papers I highlight there. Please do have a look at that if this is of interest to you, because again, I don't have a lot of time. But again, they're talking about the use of glyphosate through Europe in multiple crops, so they're really good references to look at to understand our glyphosate use patterns and how we could think about changes for the future. And really that comes back to the Weed Resistant Action Group guidelines. So this is managing glyphosate resistance. We still use these. There's 10 years since we did a lot of work to support the data that have gone into these guidelines, but they really are still valid. Thinking about preventing survivors is always the thing with weeds. You need to kill and control your weeds, and maximum efficacy. And that's true of any herbicide, not just glyphosate, but these guidelines are still very valid. So coming away from some of the challenges then and thinking about what we're doing now, current weed management solutions, again, very difficult to put them into categories, but I've just tried to do that. And again, starting again on the far left with the chemical options. So we still have very good herbicides, very good control options. They're relatively cheap, they're easy to use. We have trained agronomists that can advise on those. People understand, they're regulated. So it's just an easy, controlled way of controlling your weeds or managing your weeds, because we have a lot of information about those. It's when we start to get into some of the alternatives that it's really challenging, and again, Sean touched on that this morning. But we've seen some of the challenges. There are resistance issues, etc., etc. So if I go over to the alternatives, we think about, again, we've got a lot of tools. We've got cultural control, we've got mechanical, physical, wider rotations, diversity, but you really do need to think about your weed seed bank. That's something that really highlights for me. And then I've called it IWM because weed people like me like to stick the word weed in when we can. So it's integrated weed management. So thinking about sustainable systems, and what I am guilty of is always thinking about weeds, but we must think about how that impacts our pest and disease management as well, obviously. So how is that sustainable across your whole IPM strategy and the bigger carbon, soil health, as I touched on earlier. But with these two, this is where it gets complicated. Again, we've talked about this a bit this morning with other speakers, but we need more information and knowledge to be able to make these decisions. They're much more complex in a way, although a lot of them you're probably doing already without realising. You're choosing a variety for the soil type you've got, or you know it's competitive against the species you've got. They probably can be more costly. It's always, we've done some survey work, I'll talk about that in a moment, about the barriers for uptake for these things. They're not so straightforward, so they do require more thinking and more of a structured approach and a plan to make these work. And they can be more complicated, and there is a criticism, particularly for weed management, but some of these things can be less efficient. So particularly compared to a herbicide, that's quick and easy and simple. These require a lot of thinking. So I just want to touch on a project I'm involved in within the EU. It's called Operate. So this is a network of alternative weed solutions. We have a poster at the back and other details, and I can talk to you at lunchtime, but I just wanted to highlight the fact we're trying to bring together countries across Europe that are working on alternative weed control solutions. So in the UK, we had 2 operational groups, as we call them, looking at alternatives. So we were looking at electrical weeding and mechanical weeding, and then all our partners across the map there are doing all sorts of different aspects of weeding, and they're from including spot spraying and drone technology down to living mulches in perennial crops. So please have a look at the details and perhaps sign up to our website. But just to show you, we are trying to bring this together across Europe as well as the UK. The whole point of this project is to really look at knowledge exchange and then to produce policy recommendations for weed management for the future. So again, we want to be able to integrate these into other IPM plans or wider IPM things that people are already doing. So they're not just weed specific, but we are now in the process of trying to pull this together in the last year of the project. So just to show you, this is us out and about with the project. So we're on farm. The whole point is to do farmer to farmer demonstrations, show people new technologies, new bits of kit coming along, but also talk about competitive varieties or what systems work for them well in one crop that we can adapt to another crop. So right across Europe, we're out and about doing all these demonstrations. We've got some more coming up this year, so please do follow us and hopefully you can come along to some of our events. So taking that forward then to some of our solutions, technology and innovation, it's just phenomenal. It's changing all the time. So I've summarised a few key things here, but it's really, really hard to put these together in a few slides. So these are tractor-guided systems. So mechanical weeding, again, not new, but it's developing all the time. We've got, you know, precision-guided things that blow my mind, things I don't understand. Tractors just look amazing with all this technology. But all these things you can now do are real precision systems. The system chameleon that you can precision plant and then move your weeder across and precision weed in those rows. So there's all sorts of things mechanical weeding, and that's really exciting. Coming across to the targeted spot spraying, again, really, really exciting area. We do need pesticides within these IPM systems, as Sean said this morning. So something like the eco-robotics system. We did a demonstration event last year with VCS, who I know are here today, and it was lovely to be able to team up with them, have a look at this equipment that they're using on farm. We were in Carrotfield and showing growers how this technology, this spot spraying technology can work, and it really is the way forward, I think, with some of these systems. And obviously the Garford spot spraying systems, people are probably very familiar with those. We've got laser weeding systems. So this one, again, tractor mounted system here in field veg. This was developed in Latvia, and there now are this machinery available in the UK. I've been doing a lot of work over the years with electrical weeding. So this machine is now available in orchards and vineyards in the UK and in France. But they've now teamed up with Garford's, and hopefully we'll get some machinery that we can use in field veg systems and in the future in arable, hopefully. So inter-row electrical weeding could be the way forward. And then we move from that to the autonomous systems. So this is even more mind-blowing, but really, really exciting. So the claws system for Earth Rover. This is something, instead of a laser, it's a blue light beam. It's an autonomous system that's running through your field, identifying the weeds as it go and zapping them, which just blows my mind, but it's amazing. And this year we will be teaming up with them to do a demonstration and operate. So again, please follow our details and you can come along to that. All of these technologies very much in field veg situations, these higher value crops. So the claw system now available in the UK to buy. You know, these are things that we probably 5 years ago would never have thought we'd have, and now these are here. So very exciting, come with their challenges and obviously come at a cost, but these are things that we will be using more and more and seeing in our field situations going forward. But there's scientific developments and advancements all the time. Again, we've heard about this morning from Rosemary and Sean, talking about crop traits, plant breeding. It's really exciting what's going on in laboratories and universities. So this is something we need to use as our cultural control options for weeds. So if we can get those competitive varieties and we understand how we can use them well to suppress the weeds, this has got to be beneficial. And then if you have a variety that also has higher disease resistance or pest resistance, we can bring IPM in together. And then molecular diagnostics. A huge area of expansion, something that, again, I don't fully understand. It's just absolutely amazing what we can do with these kits. But for weed management and understanding, at the moment we're doing some work with resistance testing. So using these diagnostics for a quick test so people get results where they can then make a decision in field, in season, means we've got a tool, another tool we can use for management. So all of these things are exciting technologies for our future. So we do have many tools, and for me, for weed management, it's all about diversity. It's bringing in using everything we have as best we have. So, and again, it's stopping weed seed production. So if you can stop the seed production in your crop, stopping that shed, you are stopping the spread. So it's reducing reliance on glyphosate. We need glyphosate, we need to keep it, but we mustn't overuse it and use it incorrectly. Weed seed banks really important. We always think about things we can see, but what's underground? What are the seeds doing? How long are they there in that seed bank? And what are you going to do if you plough them back up or change your cultivation? So rotation of crops, competitive crops, cultivar choice, these are all things that you can use as cultural control tools for the future. So some of our challenges then, trying to conclude all of that, resistance management probably is up there as one of the highest, biggest challenges we've got. ALS resistance risk, I think, is something that really concerns me going forward. The broadleaf weeds in particular, this is something we've really, really got to think about. If we're now having crops that are tolerant to ALS, the ALS resistant varieties, and then we're widening the use of ALS across our rotations, this is really high risk. Use glyphosate widely. Do monitor your weeds. If you see patches emerging, get rid of them if you can. Rogue them, take them out, monitor them, remove them, whatever way, but don't let them go to seed. Unfortunately for weed management is longer term strategy. That's why coming into an IPM plan and having a plan for the future really helps. But use these techniques. We've got a lot of resources and you're probably using them already, but use them to your advantage. But do embrace these new technologies, the innovation, and it's absolutely amazing what's going on out there, and hopefully we'll have a lot of tools for the future. And as I said, integrated weed management must always be followed. And I think that's me. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lynn. And we're carrying straight on to our next speaker. Rosie's just miking herself up so I can introduce her in the meantime. Rosie Bryson is a research director at ADAS. She's a plant pathologist by background and has spent over 30 years working on crop protection in both the public and private sector. She has a passion for ensuring that applied research is communicated effectively and is achievable in its outcomes. So hopefully she's on her way. Over to you, Rosie.
I've got some builds on this and I know I'll sort of end up moving around. So good morning everybody, and also hello to everybody online. Thank you for joining. Just one thing I want to say first is we live in a very polarized world, and I think it's really important we collaborate. And AIC and AICC, there's one difference between the two of you, and that's a C. So let's try and collaborate. And I will offer myself as an independent arbiter to try to get you guys together, because I think things like IPM and lots of other technical topics, we all need to talk together. So let's get together on that. So in terms of my title today, Pesticide Resistance Management, I put the word crop productivity in there for a reason, because I think crop productivity is something that really is to the fore at the moment in a lot of discussions. And I have to hold my hands up as a fungicide person. I've been on the platform many, many times talking about resistance, talking about mutations, getting very excited about all the technical stuff. And sometimes as people that work in resistance, when we see resistance, we go, hey, great, this is something we can talk about. But actually, I think we need to think quite seriously now where we are on this topic. And I spoke to somebody the other day who works within the CropLife Europe system, who manages the efficacy working group. And I make no apologies, this is a black and white photograph, because we are really in quite a serious situation at the moment. And her quote, and again, we have the differences between AIC and AICC, but we also have people in the industry and the agrochemical industry. And sometimes scientists in the agrochemical industry are sort of perceived as the sort of devil incarnate. They work for the commercial organization, but actually a lot of them are incredibly passionate, as well as everybody else out there. And she's somebody who's worked in the industry for a long time for a chemical company, and she said to me, in terms of chemical crop protection solutions, we're heading for the abyss. And she really was quite emotional about this and quite worried. And I think the question is, what can we do about it? So this might seem a slightly odd slide to have when we talk about pesticide resistance, but I want to talk a little bit about the land use consultation that's coming up, because I think this is really important for our industry. And you might say, well, what's that got to do with pesticide resistance? I think it's got quite a lot in some respects, because 67% of the land in England is under agricultural production. And by that, there's roughly 38% arable and 29% grassland. Now, I have to confess, I haven't read every single 40 pages of the land use consultation yet, but I did take some of the figures from there. And what I did notice, certainly in the bigger text, there's no mention of horticulture there. Now, or vegetables, depending whether you want to put vegetable production, potato production within the horticultural sector. Now, I suspect that that fits within the arable area, because obviously from a land area perspective, maybe it's not huge, but the questions around land use and how horticulture fits in is crucially important. And I was at a farming conference in Norfolk a couple of days ago, and somebody there made a very valid point who was growing vegetables in Norfolk. And he said, yes, you know, I might be able to still use my land for production, but I will have my extraction license removed for water. And the point there was, actually, I still need to be able to irrigate. So land use, if that land use is taken still to be used for horticulture, but the availability of water was not there, then that person obviously can't actually produce their crop. So I think, you know, this is really quite a significant consultation process. I think it's really good that we are being asked to consult, but I would say everybody who has the opportunity, have a look at it. Now, I also got this chart from the consultation document, and I did actually get a ruler out here to try to work out whether the percentages worked, and I have to confess they probably didn't 100%, but I think that the key point here really is where we're heading to. Now, 2050, a lot of us who've been around for quite a long time talked about 2050 as if it was some sort of magical time in the future, and it's so far away that actually we don't really worry about it. But obviously 2050 now is closer to us than the millennium has been. Now, I'm getting into my dotage. You know, I won't be around talking about this in 10 or 15 years' time, but there's a lot of people that will be. 2050 is not actually that far away. And just thinking what that means in terms of loss of productive land. And as I say, these are figures which have been taken by using a ruler on this chart, so they're probably not very accurate. But by 2050, roughly 6.7% of land area is proposed to be lost. So the proposal is for 9% from what is called productive agricultural land. Now, I'm assuming that's arable and grassland, so it won't all be arable. But 9% equates to 790,000 hectares. If you think about the barley area in this country, it's roughly 1 million hectares, give or take a bit. Now, I'm not saying that's all going to come out of arable land, but it's still a significant amount in terms of area. Also, some of you may have seen the All-Party Parliamentary Group of Science and Technology strategy document, which is really, to be fair, I think is probably more of a wish strategy rather than one that is necessarily going to be implemented. But it talks about the 30-50-50 rule. And what this is talking about is 30% increase in output by 2050, but also with 50% reduction in environmental footprint. Now, that's a great strategy, and if you have a read of it, it all makes perfect sense. But the trouble is, the million-dollar question is how? You know, how are we going to increase output by 30%? You know, is this truly realistic? How are we going to measure it? What is the baseline? And actually, with all the tools we've got out there, is this achievable? Now, we've talked already about challenges to plant health in the UK, and as I'm a pathologist, I tend to favour the diseases, but of course, we've got the pests and the weeds. These are primarily in arable crops, but of course, horticulture has exactly the same issues. Now, all of these diseases, pests, and weeds are crucially difficult to control. We have major issues. We know the situation with cabbage stem flea beetle. We've lost well over 50% of the area of oilseed rape, which is slightly bizarre because actually we've lost pollinating plants and flowering plants. Lynn has just talked about where we are with the weeds. And net blotch, septoria, potato blight. Potato blight is incredibly difficult to control. We have major resistance issues there. But what I want to think about is we've talked about how valuable pesticides are. And I'm not an apologist for the pesticide industry. I think there's a lot of alternatives out there. We have IPM, of course, we have cultural techniques. We're talking about biologicals, we're talking about agri-tech. Those are all vitally important. But just for a moment, let's think about where we are with chemical control and how expensive it is and what barriers we have to developing new active ingredients. And the reality is to bring a new active ingredient to the market, if it's to be global, is roughly $300 million. Approximately 30% of that is biology, and most of us in this room probably focus on biology. We want to know that these things work. But actually, there's another 70% of the cost, which actually has nothing to do with biology. It's to do with the structure of the chemical. It's to do with storage. It's to do with regulation. It's to do with environmental toxicity, and so on and so on. Now it takes roughly 12.3 years to get a new active ingredient from first synthesis to the market. So, okay, let's think again. We've got 25 years between 2050. That's probably 2 iterations of a new active ingredient. Particularly in Europe, the pipeline for new active substances is very slow. And make no mistake, the UK is at the end of the line in Europe, not at the beginning. We have to remember, despite where we might be in the world, that actually the UK is very small. In terms of a market, it's very small. And any decision that is made in terms of new active ingredients has to be made in the context of Europe and also the world. In terms of re-registration, we have a lot of active ingredients that are on the market today that are going through the re-registration process. Interestingly, if you look at the figures, to re-register a single active ingredient costs roughly 15 million euros in Europe. That's compared to 2.1 million euros in the States. That's primarily because of regulation. If we look at the expiry dates, and this is from CropLife Europe data, the expiry dates of the majority of active ingredients on the UK and European market come within the next few years, the next 5 to 10 years. Now, I personally believe that biopesticides, agri-tech have a key role to play, but we have to be realistic. We also, there's a lot of conversations about the Precision Breeding Act. And yes, you know, the Precision Breeding Act will mean that we can actually accelerate varietal production. That's still going to take time. It's going to take 5-10 years at best to get new varieties. In some crops, probably a lot longer. We have to actually protect what we've got. This is the key message of today, because if we don't, in 10 years' time, we're going to be in trouble. Now, just thinking about the risks to active ingredients in terms of the re-registration process. It's important from an active ingredient perspective to be commercially viable across the whole of Europe. So if there's something that actually won't get registration in Europe but would in the UK, it may not be re-registered. I think one of the key areas as well, and I think this is particularly pertinent to horticulture, is that often the uses will be limited. And this is because actually it gets very complex. Every time you have a label claim on an active ingredient, you have to justify it. You have to justify why it's being used. With the best will in the world, however high value horticultural crops are in the market, from a crop protection point of view, they're not a big market. And this is where we have really quite a big dilemma. Co-formulated products, you may have one active ingredient that's perfectly okay to be re-registered, but if it's co-formulated in most cases with something that isn't, then that product will probably come off the market. Co-forms may be lost if you also have a candidate for substitution, and candidates for substitutions are ones that are identified of having significant risks. Interestingly, probably one of the things that you can help overcome candidate for substitution registration is actually if you have a resistance management problem. So a slight double-edged sword there. And also that there is I would call it a new threat. It's not really a new threat per se, but the whole PFAS regulations, and these are what are colloquially known as the forever chemicals. This is part of REACH. It's not part of the European regulation. It's a different part of legislation. This is really quite a serious problem for pesticide uses, not just for that. PFAS are used everywhere, fire retardants, etc., etc. So they're very common chemicals. There's a huge concern. They're very persistent. And if you actually look at this table, which comes from an organisation called FIDRA, which is actually from Scotland, I had to look up what FIDRA meant, and I discovered it's actually just an island off Scotland. So it's an organisation, it's a charity which looks at agricultural pressures, and you can see the list for yourself. These are active ingredients currently on the UK market which have a PFAS question over them. I'll say a PFAS question because I think it's quite complex sometimes to know what products do and don't have a PFAS criteria. But what I would say is if Belgium, for example, is planning to ban all products, all pesticide products with PFAS in, Denmark is actually looking at the same thing. I'm not quite sure how far down the line that is. From what I understand at the moment, the UK are not going down that route, but you can imagine there would be some pressure. So coming back to the main interest in resistance. When an active ingredient is launched on the market, so there's been 1 or 2 new active ingredients quite recently, the expectation is it has a life. You know, usually that life is because it works very well, but often there's competition, so maybe the life of that product may or may not carry on. If you look at something like chlorothalonil, for example, that had a life of 30 or 40 years. The challenge is if you get resistance, so if we look at the red line here, what happens is over time, that active ingredient may become less important. There may be a new active ingredient, which is actually better, is more effective, and so on. So it's like any product on the market. It comes onto the market, various pressures happen. In this case, resistance, you may not use it as much as you would have done. The challenge is, with regulation, when we have a ban or a stop, we don't have that gradual change. We don't have that shift from, yes, I might use this active ingredient now, I'll use it less, I'll use something else, because we just lose it. And that is devastating. And as you say, when we lose an active ingredient, it just stops. And I think we're beginning to see the wind-up of this now. If we look at the neonicotinoids, yes, already banned within oilseed rape, but we've also lost them in sugar beet this year after a sort of 5 or 6 year emergency registration. That will have a devastating impact. And we're not always ready. That's the point. When we think we've got something, and then for some reason we lose it. Think of that PFAS list. I don't think that's on many people's agendas at the moment. And I'm not saying they're going to go in the UK. It depends what the decision making is. But they could go. That's the point. And the point is, we then have to protect what we've got. That's what's important. So in the words of Alistair Campbell, but what can I do? And if anybody's read this, I can highly recommend it. And this isn't a political statement because there's also a very good book by Rory Stewart as well. But I would actually have a look at this because I think we all sometimes feel quite powerless to be able to do anything. And I fully accept resistance management is difficult to do. And we're not necessarily going to stop it totally, but we can do things to slow it down and mitigate it. You know, and what's important really to me, the message is to farmers out there, to agronomists out there, to the industry out there, we have to take some control. Of course, if you use a pesticide, you're going to have a selection pressure. You know, it's not rocket science. The ideal situation, as Sean alluded to, is organic farming. Don't use any pesticides. But we know that's not realistic. But what we need to do is use them sensibly, I think, and in the right way. I think it's something that Rosemary mentioned. We've got to understand how our pests, weeds and diseases actually live and work. And it seems obvious, but actually we have a lot of educational systems that spend a lot of time, very exciting molecular biology, great agri-tech out there. It's all fantastic. And there's some really, really interesting stuff. Sometimes the boring things, which is a life cycle or a pest or a weed or a disease, you know, we have to understand the target that we have, how it reproduces, where it reproduces, and so on. So we need that basic understanding. We need to think about alternative means. Actually, the less pests, weeds, and diseases we have, the less we need to use a pesticide. So what can we do to actually reduce that risk in the first place so we don't have to control them? Resistant varieties, Julie alluded to this. Sorry, Julie, I haven't put the data up, but actually a lot of the data shows that most farmers are still not actually adjusting pesticide input based on varieties. Some are, some aren't. If you think about the Precision Breeding Act, why are we bothering with the Precision Breeding Act, and why are we bothering to get resistant varieties if actually out there people are not using them to the best of their ability? Now, that's a really crucial question that we need to ask, I think. Obviously, cultivation changes that Lynn talked about as well. We need to understand the risks, and certainly I think Mark and others will talk about this later. Within the IPM and IPMNet, we have a lot of risk models. Think about how your pest may reproduce. You know, think about what the weather's doing. Think about what your crop is. Think about your variety. We need to be better, and we need to think more, and we need to take control. Read the product label. How many people out there actually read the product label? You know, it's a work of art if you actually start looking at it. It's boring, it's long, it's tedious, and it's stuck on your chemical container. But it's there for a reason, because actually it has a huge amount of information on it. Actually read it, have a look at it, see what it says. And everybody needs to play a part in this resistance management, because when they're gone, they're gone. So I've talked a lot about this, and you might say, yeah, that's great, but what do I do about it? Well, I'm not going to spend a long time talking about all the places you can get information, but actually there's a huge number of resources out there already. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We probably just need to start reading them. We need to start looking at them. All the resistance action groups in the UK, so FRAG, RAG, and IRAG, they're out there. Their websites, they've got plenty of information on. The EPO database on resistance cases. CRD actually feed the resistance cases that we identify in this country into the EPO database. So it's there. It's a bit of a dry document, I admit, and one of the challenges is it talks more about target site mutations, et cetera, What it doesn't talk about is efficacy, and it can't, because that's not its job, but it does tell you about what's out there. This is an example of a label. Now, I have to admit, I hold my hands up. I know a bit about resistance, and particularly fungicide resistance. I couldn't really tell you what those numbers mean, but I do know that they come from different resistance groups, and I do know that there is on the Resistance Action Committee websites lists of where these codes sit. It does require a bit of homework, a bit of effort, but this information is now compulsory on all chemical containers in the UK. The information is there. There's several more paragraphs than I've shown here. There's at least 3 or 4 paragraphs on every pesticide container which has resistance management information on. And also the resistance action committees. So it can get confusing. The groups are in the UK, the committees are primarily global, but actually in most cases pretty much Europe really. FRAC, the Fungicide Resistance Action Committee, IRAC for insecticides, HRAC for herbicides. They've got huge amounts of information. They've got all the chemical tables, they've got all the active ingredient tables. Use the information that's out there. So I think it is in our hands. Of course, it's hard to stop resistance. We will use chemicals, they will exert a selection pressure, but we also have some things in our control to at least slow it down. That 5 or 10 year gap is really important. It's probably longer than 10 years in reality, but we certainly have to focus our minds, and we have to do it quickly. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the speakers in the first session. We are running a little bit late for time, but I still think it's a good opportunity to ask a few questions of the speakers. So if they don't mind coming up and sitting on our little panel stage. And has anyone got any immediate questions we can... Yeah, we got... you can use Slido as well if you want to be anonymous. Otherwise, there's a roaming mic that will go around.
Hello, my name's Mark Stokes. I'm a farmer near Louth, multiple Yen Award winner. I've got a question for you, Julie. when you was doing your talk about the brown rust and that, I appreciate all the data which you've got is accurate and everything like that, but do you think the increase of brown rust, particularly in the East Midlands and that, could be a varietal thing in wheat? For example, a lot of people are now using Champion as their variety, which we all know is high in brown rust. So do you think that could be one reason for the increase in brown rust?
Yes, certainly could. I think it's probably a variety of factors. We haven't yet looked at the variety breakdown for 2023-24 season. As I said, you need everything to come together: a susceptible variety, the right weather conditions, etc., etc. But it's certainly something that we could unpick from the data to give an indication. Absolutely.
Thank you. I think there was a question.
Morning, everybody. We've heard this morning of, just recently there, of ICM. We've had IWM, and Leaf like to have IFM. Are these acronyms diluting the message of IPM?
It's an excellent question, and I'm going to pick on Lynn.
So I think we've all got to come together, haven't we? I think that Rosie said that this morning. So, I mean, I make my joke about IWN. As weed scientists, we tend to always add the W. But no, it's IPM. We need to join together. We need to do this together. And as scientists, we need to make sure we don't live in our bubbles and just do our bit of research on one thing. It's taking all of our research and joining it into the wider categories. And for IPM to work, it has to work across the board.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, to be honest, sometimes I look at IPM and think, well, it just means pest, doesn't it? But it is a generic term, and I think that the dilemma is, if we were to change it, it's actually a very well understood term across Europe as well. It's within a lot of legislation, within a lot of systems. So it may not be the perfect word for the situation we're in, but I think it's important that we make people understand what it means, and that I think the point Lynn made was that we do have to look across weeds, pests and diseases, and I think probably because we're specialists, tend to be pathologists, herbicide people, whatever, we do live in our silos a little bit, which can be dangerous.
Okay, no, I just wanted to add a bit, because it is quite confusing, but actually, I was talking about holistic growing, and actually, I think really ICM or IFM, we should all be IPM to me, or IWM or whatever, is part of IFM or ICM, and we need to look at the whole crop system, and I think more and more we also need to look at the landscape as well. So it's not just about what you do on your patch, but what others are doing on theirs, and that relates to resistance management, I think, to a great extent. So, yeah.
Thank you. Are there any other questions in the room? Sarah.
It was good you mentioned productivity, Rosie, and I think maybe we have a disconnect between productivity and the perception that IPM doesn't equal kind of productivity. Are there any thoughts from the panel in terms of how we can break down the kind of perception around that? And Sean, you talked about kind of the concerns about people trying out new IPM practices and the concern about the negative impacts. And I suppose it is that mindset and how we can improve the uptake of that mindset.
So I'll start by trying to answer that. So within the Pest and Disease Survey, we don't actually measure yield per se, but we do have measures of disease severity, which then, of course, can be linked to yield loss. So we ought to be able to look at the data, and as you said, we can identify changes in IPM, so we can look to see whether people are planning less and doing more min-till or this or that. We can also look to see whether we've lost specific chemistry and what impact that's having. So I think while it can also be used to guide IPM to show us that we can reduce pesticides if we do more of this and less of that, we can also identify situations where if we lose this chemistry or that chemistry, it has an impact on increasing disease. So we can also use it to defend our pesticides as well. So I think out of that data set, we really can start to answer these really important questions.
I think it also depends a little bit what we mean by productivity. You know, this is part of the challenge as well. You know, I won't steal Rosemary's thunder, but in horticulture, you know, it's not just about quantity, it's about quality and nutritional value and all this sort of thing. You know, the reason I talked about this land use consultation is because the mood music seems to be actually what they call it, land sparring. I honestly don't really quite understand what that means, but my interpretation is in sustainable intensification. Again, it's a bit of a buzzword, but actually it's using less land to produce the same, if not more. And I would say how, because I think it really is a $1 million question. I think it's a challenge, you know, and we're going to have to use IPM if we're going to actually get productivity to work. But there will be, you know, peaks and troughs along the way. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, and I think there's a sort of academic criticism that people don't do enough. Don't know whether cost-benefit analysis is the right thing of sort of different approaches. That's one thing. I guess case studies is another, and I mean it's something I've been trying to pursue. Which is because it's part of impact, and in universities we're supposed to do impact. And actually I was involved in a project with G's a few years ago, big salad grower, and which was about radish and managing cabbage root fly on radish. And as a result of what we all found out together, they actually changed their whole system to do with radish. Which we managed to document in a paper as well, which was really good. So just showing that, yeah, sometimes it goes beyond just changing the pest management, but also your whole approach.
Just finally on the weed aspect of that, just thinking about how you could plan ahead with your rotations and take your most productive fields are probably not the ones high with that rust. So thinking about where you plan your rotation, how you're using the best use of your land within your management plans and your SFI scheme, what should go into a cover crop, what could go into a lay, and you make the best of the best productive land you've got for that aspect, and then maybe some of the other areas where you're playing around with new techniques or that's perhaps where you could take more risks until you balance it within the land you've got.
I think we've got time for two more questions. I know you had your hand up, so Dave, do you want to?
Thank you. Lynn, you did just touch on rotation there, but Rosie, in your presentation, you referred to product development for about 12 and a half years, give or take. Well, that's only 2 rotations, or if that. So do you see a way of streamlining re-registration of the products or relaxing bureaucracy in the system?
Sorry, can you say the last bit again?
Do you see a way of streamlining the re-registrations of products or relaxing the bureaucracy in the system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's two aspects here. You know, that the 12.3 years is active ingredient, and actually there's a difference between active ingredient and product as well. You know, if you have an active ingredient, you potentially want several products because you have a segmented market, so you often have to look at co-formulated, different targets and things. So that's one aspect. I think the re-registration is really a difficult one, and I think probably one of the outcomes will be less crops,
Thank you. I know, Mark, you had a follow-up question, so perhaps we'll go to you first.
I'd just like to follow up what Sarah was asking about the productivity and everything. So what I've learned, and that through Yen and everything, and everyone has the thing that people who win Yen and that are throwing loads of inputs in and that, doing this, that and the other. I'm the opposite of that. I try to reduce everything. So probably in the last 15 to 20 years, I've increased wheat yield, especially on my farm, by 33%. By changing things, actually doing a lot of IPM stuff, but not in the extent I am. I agree with what Sean said. Weather is over 80%, if not more, the key factor. I'm fortunate enough where I live, I'm in a microclimate, and then 20% is probably skill and everything. So yes, I reduced cultivations mainly. I'm now through SFI. I've looked at all my poor land, taking them out of productive things, putting them in SFI, and then concentrating on my higher yielding land to try and get the same amount of yield from the field than I would by only doing a small percentage of it. Also through SFI is helping me with the insecticides, so now I've got rid of insecticides. Use of legume fallows and that, which I'm hoping to do a survey on. I'm open to anyone who's willing to do tests and seeing what beneficials I'm getting out of my legume fallow, which then can be used to help future pest things. Appreciate what Sean says. We don't know the weed management side, what we're going to get through these things, so there's all them things to look at. This is my first year of it, so it's a big learning curve. So I think 2050, we can increase productivity, the good thinking farmers can actually increase productivity by 30%, and that in 2050.
Thank you, Mark. That's a really, really useful drawing across from what we're learning in Yen as well. I think we've got time for one more quick question. Thanks, Lucy.
Thank you. I'd probably like to play devil's advocate here, really. Might it be because the decisions we're making about UK agriculture are basically political decisions? There is some backing of the science, but it's primarily a political decision. And many political decisions don't always come to fruition. We've not seen the 1.5 million extra houses yet. Maybe we will. Does the panel think actually the goals we've set ourselves are the wrong goals? We've set ourselves a zero carbon agriculture with 35% increase. Do we really believe that we've been spending all these years making a mess of it? The goal is incredibly difficult. I'd just like your views on that, please.
Well, maybe I should quote Daniel Zeitner from the Norfolk Conference, it is what it is, you know. And the reality is that we live in a political world, you know, and I think we have to appreciate that our politicians have various goals that they want to achieve. We live in a democracy, we can vote for whoever we choose to vote for. I think sometimes we have to focus on what we can achieve. And
So thank you very much to all our 4 speakers and to Sean this morning. We're going to take a break for 15 minutes, but we need to come back quite promptly, so I appreciate your help on that. You will see on your tables there are some IPM Net reports. That's something that will be talked about in the next session, so please do take a look at those. We do appreciate your feedback on them. So a final thank you to all the speakers, and we'll see you back in here at 22. Thank you, everyone. We'll make a start on the next session. So I hope you've all come back refreshed, and we're now going to look a bit more detail at what happens on farm with IPM. And our first speaker is Holly Alpren, who is a pesticide scientist at Defra in the Chemicals, Pesticide and Hazardous Waste Department, supporting research and development of IPM in the UK.
Hi everyone, thanks for the intro, Mark. So, really interesting topics already covered today, and I'm sure I'll talk about some of them. Some of the same issues are going to be coming up, but really nice to have all these people in the room to discuss IPM and IPMNet. I realised Ella was talking about the actual results of IPM after, so I won't take up too much time because I'm sure that's what we all want to hear about. I'm going to mention a bit about our policy aims within our team at Defra. Mostly what I talk about when I do these kind of presentations is a lot of the projects that we fund. However, this is a day where everyone is presenting those projects, so they've taken away quite a lot of my talk, but I'll cover some of the ones that haven't been mentioned so far, and then some of the IPM comms we're doing and what we're going to focus on in the future. So IPM lies at the heart of the government's approach to minimising the environmental impact of pesticides and trying to support sustainable agricultural productivity. We've commissioned a range of research projects looking into barriers to IPM uptake, how best to promote IPM, and also filling evidence gaps for pests, weeds, etc. And we're trying to promote a range of different IPM resources and tools to increase knowledge of what IPM means and how it can be done. I'm sure we'll hear lots more about those different resources today. So most of the projects that we've been funding focus either on filling sort of research and development evidence gaps or encouraging knowledge transfer. So the first one I'm going to talk about was done by Ferrer, and this was looking at IPM uptake and across a number of case studies. So there were 16 case studies altogether, going from low to high IPM uptake. Surprisingly, it was difficult to get the low IPM uptake people to participate, which might say a lot in itself, but we did manage to get a few interested. So some of the barriers that came up across these different case studies, farmers were suggesting that the risks associated with IPM are clear and near term, whereas some of the benefits are less clear and over a longer term. And much of the decision-making in agriculture was viewed as reactive and frequent. So as we've mentioned, a lot of the decision-making, that IPM decisions don't happen in isolation. There's a lot of different decisions that are being made on farm, and that all has to play in together. Also, the complexity of the decision-making process. So the agronomist can be a driver or a barrier to IPM implementation, and there's a lot of discussions between families, etc., as to what kind of decisions are being made on farm. These decisions can't be made independently from other farming decisions, and right decisions 1 year are not the same for the next due to weather, etc., as has already been mentioned. And there was a sense from the farmers that the amount of information for all aspects is overwhelming, and it's quite difficult to tell which sources to trust. And what has come up in a lot of meetings I've been in recently is how to get information across clearly to farmers. How do they receive information? How can we discuss it? How can we make it clear to them? So in terms of the sort of different factors going from those farmers with low IPM uptake to higher IPM uptake, the low IPM uptake farms there was a more complex decision-making process and potentially less trust in some of those relationships, and a real or perceived lack of resources means that there's a reduction in the risk tolerance. So a lot of this is about risk tolerance, risk aversion, and how we can manage that. And also what came up, a mistrust of policy and government. So potentially that's explaining why they didn't want to join our study in the first place. And then on the high IPM uptake, more trusting, sort of simpler relationships for decision-making, still about the availability of resources in terms of risk tolerance, and in order to encourage more IPM uptake in those that were already doing some, they viewed a lack of scientific and technological progress, although we've heard a lot about progress this morning. And the policy implications from our side is looking at providing training on IPM and farm management, and also investing in R&D. So those are the sort of two aspects we're looking at. In these case studies, the most cited IPM activities that were being used, pest monitoring and trapping, increasing or changing rotations, Physical weed removal, like Lynn was mentioning, variety selection for resistance has come up a lot today, and we know from the AHDB work on the recommended list that a lot of farmers are choosing more based on resistance or tolerance rather than purely yield. Managing soil health, not using insecticides, and altering drilling dates, although obviously the drilling dates are somewhat to do with the weather as well. So they also had policy recommendations at the end. So continuing to promote and support on-farm IPM trials, as we're going to hear more about today. And this was really about peer-to-peer knowledge sharing networks. You know, the farmers like to learn from each other. They don't necessarily want to hear it from us. So trying to encourage that knowledge sharing is a really positive area. And increasing availability and support for training to both farmers and agronomists on IPM, as well as investing in R&D. The second study I'm going to mention was quite a small study, which Philip Walker here was involved in, where we were trying to sort of capitalise on these big reviews that ADAS did previously, looking at IPM uptake in arable and non-arable. These are really detailed reviews. They're about 200 pages each, massive detailed tables, and we were trying to sort of summarise that information to make it useful for policy decisions or for policy conversations. And these were the scorings in these tables were based on expert ratings by both ADAS and Scotland Royal College, based on peer-reviewed papers, project reports, etc. So we chose to summarise these in a more visual way so that we could use the information. So we looked at cereals, potatoes, oilseeds, legumes, brassicas, and apples. So we tried to look, the tables in the original reviews looked at many different factors, including strength of evidence, such as implementation, cost, etc. But in terms of the strength of evidence, 5 would count as there's really strong evidence that this IPM strategy works, and therefore it would be good for knowledge exchange, down to a score of 1, which would be there's potential, but there's little evidence or research done to explain how it works or how it works best. So this is just an example of one of the crop maps for wheat, barley, and oats. So along the top, you can see different diseases, key diseases, pests, and weeds, and then the different IPM strategies going from the planning stage to pre-cropping and in-crop. And then this was basically trying to summarize that strength of evidence score. So if you can see a blue, that means there's really strong evidence. You can see that the line with the most blues in is field history rotation and break crops, as has been mentioned a lot. Whereas something like decision support, which is a bit further down, there's quite a few ones. So, you know, this has a lot of potential, but there's not necessarily as many models or as many tools to be able to be used. So we can also use these tables to look at all these different factors. So speed of impact, economic importance, inexpensive to implement. All these are things that, you know, farmers are going to need to consider when they're thinking about which IPM strategies to implement. We also tried to combine all of these really complex tables into one summary table, which they did very effectively. And you can see these are the top 20 IPM strategies across all the crops that we looked at. So the colours are kind of how many of the different strength of evidence. So those at the top had really strong evidence that they're effective. So the top few, for example, field history, rotation and break crops, decision support, primary cultivations and varietal choice. You know, these are really good strategies for knowledge transfer. So these are some of the ones that really work across the board. We have lots of evidence. We should be highlighting these to farmers. And as we've said, farmers are already doing a lot of these as part of their decision making anyway. And then towards the lower end, maybe this is something we can focus more R&D funding on. So for example, use of cover crops or bioprotectants, low risk PPPs, you know, where should we be investing funding so that they can be utilised more? Then more on, this was a project kind of looking at some of the R&D evidence gaps. So I forgot to put, this was by NIAB. I forgot to put their logo on. So this was looking at cabbage stem flea beetle in winter oilseed rape. So they developed the CFB Smart network. So this was for sharing management and research tools. And they did emergence trapping for both for adults and stem evacuation method to look at larvae. And what they found as part of this was that emerging from the crop happened later than was thought previously using these emergence traps, and that this gave an opportunity that post-harvest you could cultivate and that would reduce numbers. And this is, you know, a relatively small number of sites, but this was, I think, the best site, not that I'm cherry picking, but this shows that without cultivation, the level of CFB emergence, and when cultivation, there was a reduction by 62%. So, you know, there's a lot of potential there to use cultivation to manage numbers more effectively. And they also found some evidence that companion crops might help to reduce the stem larvae. So important work done there. Then I just wanted to highlight some of the projects that have been done by the Farming Innovation Programme. So This is Defra funded programme, and a lot of IPM projects have been funded through this scheme. So this is just a few examples. So this is synthetic pheromones for pest control in forest bug, looking at novel fungicides for wheat pathogens, and like Lynn's mentioned earlier, herbicide-free light-based weeding. So a number of different IPM projects have been funded through this, which is really positive. So I've gone for IDM just because I wanted to not upset the pathologists. Obviously, there's a lot of conversation about how we talk about it. This was an Integrated Pest Management series of videos that Neil Pavley and Frank van der Bosch put together for us last year before Neil retired. So we wanted to glean all the information we could from him before he left. And they decided to focus on disease. A lot of this could be applied to pests and weeds, but they kind of focused on disease for the narrative. So this focuses on disease control in cereals, and it was really meant as a translation between more complex scientific literature, which we really don't think farmers are going to have the time to read, and simpler videos on this is what IPM is, this is how you do cover crops. This was supposed to go through the theory and the practice, how the kind of biology will influence your decision making on farm. So this is kind of for farmers that are probably already engaged in IPM already, for agronomists, for potentially agriculture students as well, and this is all available on YouTube, so I encourage you to take a look. And these are the topics that it covers. So crop productivity and foliar disease, disease control methods, and then there also is a couple on fungicide resistance. This has come up a lot already today, and the environment. So really worthwhile series to look into. I also wanted to mention that ADAS, again, come up a lot. Natural England have managed to publish the report on IPM for biodiversity enhancement. The first part of this review summarises 7 different IPM projects, which you can see there, conducted between 1981 and 2005. And then the second part is reviews reports concerning the evidence of the effect of IPM on biodiversity, mostly from a species abundance aspect. And just to highlight that Natural England have also commissioned a literature review with Harper Adams on integrating more soil biological factors into IPM. So they were saying there's a lot of IPM above ground, but really we should be looking below ground as well. So that should finish soon, and hopefully will be published in the near future. We've also been trying to increase communications on IPM. So my colleague developed this IPM.gov.uk page, which we launched in November. This includes the aims and principles of IPM, what it means in practice, kind of examples from farmers, and tools and resources that farmers can use. This was promoted through the Defra farming blog and the newsletters, and it had over 800 reviews by mid-January, so hopefully this is being utilised by a lot of people. In terms of upcoming comms, we're also developing blog posts for both the Defra farming blog and the RPA blog, and we're looking at a farming advisory service newsletter. And we are also planning a podcast. So if there are any farmers or agronomists that would be keen to participate in a podcast and talk about IPM for half an hour, we'd really like to hear from you, so do come and see me. In terms of future plans, as has been mentioned a lot already today, we're really interested in pesticide resistance monitoring, trying to understand more from a UK perspective, how variable is it spatially, which are the highest risks, etc. So understanding the landscape of that a bit better. And we've got a project with ADAS looking into that, which we'll report soon. And then also biological control. This has been mentioned as a really innovative new area with a lot of potential, and there are a lot of evidence gaps. So, more evidence on exactly how they work, within what parameters, more information will be really beneficial to farmers, hopefully. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Holly. So our next speaker is Ella Bradfield. She's a crop pathology consultant at ADAS and working on integrated approaches for disease management, but she also is managing the IPM Net project. So she's going to talk a bit about where we are with that data collection and highlights now.
Thank you, Mark. It's lovely to see some people in person, and thank you to those who have joined online as well. So, as Mark mentioned, I've been managing the IPM Net pilot project for the last few months, and then today I'm going to give a brief overview of the results so far, introduce some preliminary results, and mention some of the further work to be done. So firstly, for those of you who aren't already aware, IPM Net was created in June 2023. in a call for a better understanding of IPM on farm to improve decision making for farmers and better inform policies to promote IPM strategies. The first part of IPMNet was to create a network of farmers and agronomists and establish processes for collecting relevant data. We have then combined the data from growers to allow benchmarking from the network. And once the analysis is complete, we will share these findings with the network and encourage discussion around which areas require more data collection and analysis as well. So from this pilot year, we have had 23 IPMNet entries from 16 individual farmers and agronomists, and this is coloured by region on the map. We then combined this data with yen cereal data and found 24 suitable data entries from 17 individuals. And we combined these to make 47 entries to use for benchmarking, and they have quite a good geographical spread of England and Wales. So this is the data set that we're using for benchmarking. Of these 47 entries, 75% were winter wheat, and the other 25% is comprised of winter and spring barley and winter and spring oats. Therefore, if you were growing one of the minority crops, the benchmarking may be slightly less reliable than if you were growing winter wheat. So the variety grown is a key factor in considering pest and disease pressure. So it's interesting to see whether pesticide applications are adjusted accordingly. In the report, we include information on your chosen variety and how it compares with others growing the same crop type. And the resistant ratings are those set out by the AHDB recommended lists. This example shows spring barley with your variety in blue and the other spring barley growers' varieties in red. We have also gathered information on cultivation strategy, and most entries say that their main cultivation strategy is ploughing or deep non-inversion tillage. Data on other agronomic factors was collected, such as previous crop type and whether a cover crop was used, as these may influence certain pests and diseases. Seed dressing may also reduce the pressure of diseases such as takel. So in the reports, we use several box plots, and the IPMNet data is benchmarked against IPMNet or yen members who are growing crops in the same season. The example report uses winter wheat as the example, and therefore this is benchmarked just against winter cereals. The data in the example reports that you've been given is actually benchmarked against all the IPMNet and yen entries, but the values used in the IPMNet report are an example. So your value is shown in orange. 50% of the IPMNet or yen values are in the grey box, and the whiskers, which are the horizontal black lines, show the highest and lowest values in the data. So from the raw data that we collected, we have calculated a treatment frequency index value, which provide an indicator of the amount of pesticide applied. The metric is commonly used, and in fact it's an official indicator in France for the evolution of pesticide use. However, there are certain limitations to TFI in that it does not consider the efficacy or the nature of the chemical, and therefore TFI alone does not reflect the status of an IPM approach or the environmental impact. This is calculated by dividing the dose applied by the maximum individual dose permitted for each product and adding them together to create a total TFI. So for example, if you applied a full rate of Revistar and a full rate of Arizona, their maximum individual dose is 1.5 litres. And then that would give you a fungicide TFI of 2. However, if you only applied half rates of each product, you would get a TFI value of 1. It's also worth mentioning that if you were just spraying half of the field, the TFI would be halved, but this doesn't apply to our entries. So in our reports, our preliminary reports, we have only calculated the herbicide, insecticide and fungicide TFIs. We haven't done this for PGRs, seed dressings or biostimulants. So for herbicides, most cereal growers in the network applied at least one herbicide application, and in most cases, multiple applications were made. The highest TFI was 9. This does include pre-drilling, pre- and post-emergence applications. For insecticides, approximately half of all the growers in the network applied no insecticides, and those who did mostly applied 1 or 2. The highest was 4. For fungicides, most cereal growers in the network applied multiple fungicides split between 2 and 4 applications. In some cases, higher treatment frequencies were reported, but as we've seen, brown rust levels were very high in the 2024 season, so that may reflect that more chemistry was needed than anticipated. So yes, I've mentioned the preliminary reports. This just brings all of the information into one place to evaluate individual approaches. Please do let us know if you have any feedback on this to make it more user-friendly. We have some further data analysis to do to expand and improve the data, including benchmarking with the Defra Pest and Disease Survey, as Julie has mentioned this morning, because it's such an extensive database and has pesticide product application information that we can use to calculate TFI, and that would be really useful to see that historic database. There is also scope to use more yen data, so the yield enhancement network data for both cereal and oil seeds, and we'll be able to see that over years as well. Weather data would also be useful to incorporate to see whether there are different pest pressure differences between regions, as would further investigation into the role of biopesticides, seed dressings, and decision support systems. And then lastly, we would like to combine underlying data from the network with specific data on a particular topic. So using what we have learned from analysing the pilot data, we will analyse hub data and discuss and disseminate results. So we have some potential ideas of hubs that we could create, and we already have some hubs one on BYDV and one on companion crops. But there are some really good questions we could ask from all of this data, and actually if we have specific questions focused in a hub, that could be really useful, that we could disseminate the results across the whole network, especially over years data in the hub could be very useful. So yeah, I haven't got a thank you slide, but I just want to say a massive thank you to all of the IPMNet members who have provided data. Thank you to Defra for funding the IPMNet pilot, and thank you to the steering group as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ella. I am involved in that project as well, and just a further thank you to all the farmers who've been involved in that, because providing this kind of data is time-consuming and not as straightforward as you might hope. So it is quite an effort to bring all that into one place and start to make sense of it. Our next speaker is David Bell, who's a mixed farmer producing a range of crops on his 400 hectares up in East Fife. He has a keen interest in IPM and has recently been appointed the chair of the Voluntary Institute. So a very fitting speaker for us today. So I'll pass over to you, David.
Morning, everybody. Voluntary initiative, Mark, but we're not institute yet, but we may be coming. No, thank you, everyone, and good afternoon. I was going to start with a good morning, but apologies for that. Yep, mixed farming in East Fife. Sorry, the notes aren't up on the presentation mode. So covering different cereals, so winter barley primarily for the feed cattle, excess is sold off farm, winter wheat for biscuits, feed, distilling, spring barley for malting and some for seed as well. Our potatoes generally for wear, but we do have early salads as well, different points in the rotation, and we also have farm safe seed. We have a closed herd of Aberdeen Angus sucklers, and we breed our own replacements, and we finish everything off ourselves. We're in an agri-environment climate scheme, so you may have picked up East Fife, Scotland, so we don't have SFI. Up north we have a different scheme, similar pros and cons, and we can look south of the border and be envious at some things and quite pleased we don't have other things. But mainly focus on utilising buffer zones, winter bird cover, hedges and green manures. Yeah, I was asked implementing IPM on farm. This is how I would have done it if it had been so structured, but as you'll get a feel as farmers, we grow into things as we understand IPM, and as we understand what it means to us and our ground, we grow into how we implement it and understand it as well. But with IPM, we also need to focus on making money. We're businesses and we have to make profit. You have to understand the farm ecosystem. So from understanding that, we have to know how your farm works. Identify the key pests, the weeds and diseases, soil testing through YEN, SOIL, SASA. I have to give a nod to YEN and ADAS for giving me the confidence to go forward with one of their, I don't think they do it anymore, with the soil health reports. When hopefully, yeah, you can see that. If that's a standard field, and had a couple of these over the years, and it gives you the great confidence to go forward with reduced tillage or low inversion, different ways of establishment. But we also do with SASA PCN testing to make sure we're putting our potatoes in the right place. We have variety choice, nematicide choice, whether to apply or not, because there's good nematodes as well as bad nematodes. And as it was referred to earlier with insecticides, we don't do insecticides for cereal crops because of the good predators you kill as well as the bad ones. Preventative measures. So a varied crop rotation. So we have potatoes, winter wheat, spring barley, winter barley, peas, grass, green manures to disrupt the pest cycle. The cereals, break crops, legumes for soil health. We have physical boundaries like hedges. They're great for biosecurity for cattle. So I don't have just a fence splitting my herd and my neighbour's herd apart from each other. I have a physical boundary of a hedge so they can't get their noses together. Basics like that, but also they have an increased benefit with the habitat for the natural predators, for the biodiversity, and having those corridors of connection between other parts of the farm. plus I utilise it for support payment with my EFA. So it has a three-way benefit. So it's understanding what works for the environment, what works financially, and what works for health. And rotation. But also with preventative measures is regular crop inspections, monitor pressures, visual thresholds of pests, greatly improved by a good relationship with my agronomist. Unfortunately not an independent agronomist, but he is, I understand why I use a serviced agronomy package rather than an independent one, because I'm not as on farm as I used to be. But there are places for all agronomists, independent and non-independent, out there for that. Cultural and mechanical controls. Ploughs aren't evil. There's a move to demonise them at some points. Yes, we want to reduce our soil movement and our inversion, but they're a great tool in rotation sometimes. I need them. I have potatoes, so I have to plough. I have plenty stones in my soil, and I'm not fortunate enough to just go direct into the ground. But also reduces overwintering pests and weed pressure, having that inversion. And we need to be mindful it's part of the solution, not a problem with that. I do all forms of establishment. You probably can't see it overly well. And is there a pointer? Yep, oh, there you go. So that was a trial with ADAS and Syngenta. It's probably not the best one, but it was a conventional min-till and direct drill. But I love direct drilling into 5 foot tall standing cover crops and green manures. It's an amazing experience when you get into it. It looks horrendous over winter and a real mess. But we have to, as farmers, get away from the look. It's not about a brown field and seedlings. It's about the whole system approach. But within those cultural mechanicals, yeah, we try and use cover crops. They're not always as good. I feel we have a smaller operational window for us in central Scotland than you guys do down here. So we have to be more mindful of it. And they can make a mess out of you if you don't utilise them as a proper crop. But where we can, I do like to let the roots do the work of the metal. You know, instead of going through with inversion tillage, just let the roots make it more friable for you. Within that cultural and mechanicals, seed treatments as well we touched on. I utilise a variety, mainly in nutrition, but do have some fungicides as well. Satellite imagery for mapping and VR applications of my variable rate, of seed and fertilizer. Yield and soil mapping for less productive areas. I put into buffer zones or environmental areas, so utilising the more productive parts of the field for where the money is. And GPS sectional control on the sprayer. I'm fortunate. I get my new sprayer home next week, I think. So it's got individual nozzle control. I'm quite excited about that one. And it's still a dream. Well, not a dream. It's still a real pleasure using the sprayer and getting the suit off and getting the tie off and getting it into the tractor cab to be able to get in the fields and know that you're doing good with the plant protection products that we put on the fields. But with that mechanical control, we've got individual nozzle control. You have the correct nozzle for the correct application, correct active ingredient, and automated height control, all making sure that you're using the active ingredients and plant protection products to the best of their design. I think it's good to highlight with the resistant varieties a good plug for HDB. They do some great work with the cornerstone of any IPM plan is the recommended list. Yes, I engage with industry. I used to sit on the recommended list for barley and oats, and I'm a strong supporter of the work AHB does for another hat I wear. And I think that the team here, some of the team, guys, right behind me. But not only with the knowing the correct variety, there's some great tools like the variety selection tool out there that helps you give decision support for the type of ground you have and the market you're destined for, so you can utilize the right variety for your requirements. It's empowering growers to make that decision. I also utilize FYM. We make a lot of shit with the cattle, and but I also import it. I think it's important. I'm a bit of a, no, I better not say that word, but I really do think organic manures are pretty integral to the mixed farming solution, and I as a slight tweak or a rant, I'll say regenerative farming dilutes the message, and it should be mixed farming, and we often try and rebrand or make things sexier, but sometimes mixed farming, when you appreciate what you have rather than trying to tart it up a bit. So within the RL, we have disease resistance. We look at but I look at the untreated values more than the treated values. I think you learn a lot more from what's not been applied than what has been applied. But we have, every farmer is different. Every farm is different geographically and topographically. So what works for me might not work for someone else. So it's having that that choice is out there. I lengthen my rotation to mitigate soil pests, primarily in potatoes, with FLN and PCN. Maintaining soil health, using the RB209, which I recently chaired the review of. And I think it's important to utilise that knowledge that's out there for our understanding of offtake and our understanding of how to make use of bulk organic manures. I referred to that earlier before I switched myself off, was that I import FYM. I also have straw for muck deals. I bring in hen pen, which you may not be familiar with that colloquialism, hen litter, chicken litter. But that comes at a cost of IPN because I'm importing stuff onto my farm. I've never grown rye in my life, but sometimes I get the occasional rye plant up, and what other pests am I bringing onto the farm? So with the improvements in soil health I'm doing with my manure, I'm also bringing in stuff, but I'm aware of that. I used to buy in stock feed potatoes for my cattle. It's a great feed for finishing and for giving cattle. However, the biology was not good enough to convince me, or the scientists couldn't convince me that I wasn't introducing pests because the ruminant of the cattle, the dung, the middening of the FYM, they couldn't convince me that it would break down the pathogens for potato health. So I cut that out because potatoes is one of my cash crops. So you really need to be focused on what is making money and what is going to potentially do more damage for the rotation going forward. Because there's always a limiting factor, and we have to be mindful of it. I think, Sean, you referred to it earlier and almost kind of stole my thunder a little bit, but hopefully you can see that. That's a first wheat after potatoes, and I don't use insecticides on the farm for cereals, but I do use it for potatoes. It's a higher risk, higher cash crop, but I find that as a badge of honour that I can still use insecticides on my potatoes, but the bounce back is there because you've built up a more of a resistant and resilient biodiversity on your farm. When you do have to use a product, the environment and the biodiversity bounce back. So yeah, it's great. And then I have another field. I have another photo of my green wellies are white because of walking through all the webs, and it's a real badge of honour having that there. But sparing use of plant protection products, as I mentioned, I work with my qualified basis agronomist, who I'll mention Ian Anderson, who's I wouldn't be very good without him. And I use the plant protection products as recommended to maintain resistance, different modes of action. We work together to understand what's the best use of it. I'll let him do most of the reading of the product label, but it is a conversation and robust at times. We put products in the right place. The other photo is not one of my operators. It's not me. That's a friendly neighbour who doesn't use genuine products, and I think you get what you pay for sometimes. I try and use genuine products. I feel they have a better mixing ability, especially within tank or spreading capabilities. I do use adjuvants to improve efficacy and minimise the actual use of the plant protection product. Drift retardants, water conditioners, all to make sure that the product I'm using, the active ingredient, is better utilised for the growing crop. If we're putting the money on and spending the time going over the crop, we have to make sure it's in the right place and getting the best out of it. Record keeping. I saw last week a thing from Defra that average farmer does 400 hours of paperwork a year. I don't. I think I'm possibly over that, but yeah. Anyway, we do a lot of it, but are we doing the right stuff? A lot of IPM and record keeping, we record what we do rather than what we don't do. And we should be more mindful of recording the decisions that we take not to apply, not to do a control, because that's proving that we're doing the right thing. Although it seems counterproductive when we're short of time. Yeah, you can see my IPM plan up there. Yeah, I don't score 100, but it's not a contest in that respect. It's understanding what you've done to get there. I'm assuming that the non-Scottish IPM plans are similar, set out with your percentages, but I'm as alluded to, and I'll come on to. I'm the chair of the VI, and IPMs are our thing, but we. You don't have to have 100%. It's a cultural thing. It's a mindset. It's a move towards. It's part of the system. And if we don't start somewhere, we can't improve. And the great thing about the IPM plan is that it gives you suggestions of cultural improvements, of ways to move forward. So it's not just a metric to be gauged against each other. I think it's becoming more important with the Scottish Government are putting it part of their cross-compliance. So for support next year and going forward, everyone has to have done an IPM plan, but everyone has to do IPM plans as well for crop assurance. So it shouldn't be a hard thing to do. Use of monitoring tools to understand pest pressures. So on the my right, your left. Soil moisture for irrigation purposes. Water is going to be a huge, or is a big problem, or lack of, mostly, especially for potatoes. So I use soil moisture probes to make sure I have the full understanding of my irrigation requirements. I use the tools that are on the HDB website for aphids, for BYDV, understanding the pressures that are out there. There's loads of monitoring tools, Blightcast for potatoes, and yes, our agronomists, independent or not, will have access to these, and generally that's how most farmers and growers get their information about forecasting, and from our agronomists, because the agronomists are an integral part of the team for any farm, whether the farmer likes it or not, or it gives them enough recognition. Yeah, it's a good balance, IPM. There's not one variable that is the clear path. It's a mixture of it all. Yeah. The VI, yeah, I'm really proud and really excited to be the new chair of the voluntary initiative. Hopefully my public speaking will improve as I do more of this, so good luck everybody out there. It's 8 industry sponsors came together to avoid a pesticide tax back in 2001, I think, and you know, it's really important when we have the advisors and distribution, landowners, machinery manufacturers, plant protection producers, contractors as well as the 3 main farming unions all together as a really great way of showing good stewardship and the best practice within industry. Neuroso as well as an integral part of the VI was introduced as the CPD scheme, one of the first in Europe, if not the first, clearly the best one in Europe. As current chair of Neuroso, I'd say that. To have an industry CPD scheme where we can prove that our operators put our plant protection products in the right place, have continual professional development, is a great way of ensuring that we have a good stewardship. The National Sprayer Testing Scheme was already running before VI was introduced, but it has come together to strengthen the stewardship and effectiveness. The VI has some key strategic aims. We want to demonstrate the industry's ongoing commitment to best practice in plant protection use by increasing IPM adoption. We want to establish the VI as the leading authority on plant protection stewardship among government, industry and stakeholders. I want to reduce the environmental impact of plant protection product use and relating farming practices on water and biodiversity, and leverage opportunities for the advancement of UK agriculture in the post-Brexit era. It's just good farming, and I think the industry, with great respect to a lot of you in the room, researchers, we tart stuff up too much, and it's just good farming to put your products, your plant protection products, in the right place. And as a farmer, I like to think of it as more of, I'm not wasting money. You know, I'm putting the expensive chemicals or expensive fertilizers in the right place for the right growing crop. I'm not putting it in water. I'm putting it on my ground, so I get that return on investment. We also have a good focus of the VI is the water. Less so in Scotland, because we don't waste as much money putting active ingredients into watercourses as my English cousins who have far too much money to throw it away seem to do. But yeah, so we work closely with the water companies, the Environment Agency up in Scotland, the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, the National Resources Wales, and the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs in Northern Ireland. I mean, I joke, but there's more water up in Scotland, and we're not as densely populated, so that's why. But we do have a huge, and this is only some of them, of the cross sector of the industry that are partners within the VI and support it regularly. And I think it is really quite important to recognise that this is not just a small organisation. It's for the benefit of the whole industry, and I also want to shout out to Defra for sponsoring me. So thank you very much. That's my position, sponsored by as chair. But it's there's a lot of us in the room that represent these organisations as well. So it's a thank you for supporting the VI, whether you know you're supporting it or not, and moving forward. Similar to Ella, oh no, we've got one more yet. We have VI champions as well. So these are some farmers, some advisors, some researchers, catchment officers, professional sprayer operators, all who are available to engage with industry, to speak at events, to give a hands-on experience of best practice within the environment, within IPM. But it's great to see Henry up in Kirkwall, right down to Plymouth and over in Northern Ireland as well. So, you know, we are well spread and available, and probably better speakers than I am as well at some of these events. So yeah, that is the champions, and that is up to John next.
Thank you very much, David. I think you don't do yourself justice. That was a really fascinating talk then. So next we have John Gadsby, my colleague at ADAS, who is a consultant and using his years of experience as a farm manager in East Anglia to support farmers and agronomists in developing their businesses. Over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, so I've been a couple of bits on this. One, I must apologise. Everyone else's presentations appear very professional compared to mine. I've got animations and polls and all sorts, so if nothing else, it will wake you up before lunch. Yes, as Mark says, background in farm management, joined ADAS 4.5 years ago, and this is there's a bit of this is why I've got involved. My ADAS colleagues in the room are all much cleverer and much more scientific than I am. I am what in the days of math was termed a Gen Ag consultant. I do a bit of everything to a reasonable level. So yeah, joined ADAS at the same time. Brother said, what were you doing for the farm management? So I was doing about 100 hours a week. So you'll get bored doing 40 hours a week, so you better get involved in that as well. So I still farm as well, not quite back up to 100 hours a week yet, but it's good. It keeps me looking at both sides of this. One of the things of many that surprised me, fairly large-scale potatoes and onions in East Anglia was my last farm management job. Got involved in farming at home, and I remember the first farm assurance inspection, farm and a couple of bits of contract farming, our agronomist, who's a distributor, sorry, John's left, he's so fed up, said, oh, I've done your IPM plans for you, ready for farm assurance, which, as a bit of a change from historically, I'd done the IPM plans, I'm basis qualified farm manager, and that complete disconnect. Here's a piece of paper so you can pass your farm assurance, which surprised me coming from sort of farm management company and then large-scale farming, how far apart people were from IPM, probably at the other end of the industry, the other side of the industry. So that's where I came in initially. So why IPM plans? There's loads of stuff. Sean alluded to this, everyone's alluded to this. The whole day today has been lots of research, lots of information. There is stacks of information out there, but it is all over the place, and I didn't realise my desk was going to be quite so big on the screen. Desk in my case, probably a plastic box in the back of a pickup in the case of a lot of the agronomists in the room here. There's all this information out there, but it's not particularly easy to get at, and I think from a farmer's point of view, it's not particularly easy to tie in what you're looking for. You know, what bit of IPM do I want to look at? So not long after I joined ADAS, Neil Pavely, who's been mentioned today, and Phil Walker, who's here, had an initial project with Defra looking at farmer approaches to getting farmers to do more IPM. And we looked at that and said, well, we need to monitor how that IPM is being recorded. We can't just say, are you doing more IPM because we came and spoke to you about it, or are you doing more IPM because we sent you a leaflet about it? So on the back of that, we developed a tool. So we had a means of checking what people were doing depending on how it was disseminated. Oh, sorry, yes, told you lots of polls. If you can, please respond to that one. I would expect in the audience today it's going to be lots of yeses. But give you a moment to do those. Or there's only 2 of you here. Does that carry on, Kate? Yes, I can pass on to the next slide. Brilliant. Thank you. So the first version of the talk we did was Excel-based, and I only dug this out again. This was 3 or 4 years ago, and actually I think we did a fairly good job. The idea behind this was that you would be able to look at what are my problems across the top, and you can then enter whether it's a problem or not, and then you can look down the column and say, what are the potential solutions? Now this comes from the piece of work shown earlier that ADAS were involved in, and also an element Lynn and others in the room inputted into this. So we went, right, which of these options should we include in here? And it's all a little bit sort of Windows 95 in its outlook, but it's all there. Yeah, you hover over stuff and it tells you why that's a good idea. So that was version 1, and you can see there you select what level of issue is, and whether you're doing it. And we went, am I using it? Will I use it next year? Will I use it in future? Will it not work on my farm? For example, if it says ploughing and you're a wholly direct drilling farm, you're not going to change that element to have that IPM option, or is it not used? So the difference there, because this was all slightly fed from a research point of view as well, was how many people are using approaches that they could be, how many people are not using approaches they could be using, and how many people are not using approaches because they don't want to use them. So that was the reason for that level of questioning. And yes, there's a bit of colour coding there. Yeah, as I say, pretty basic, but as a good first step and to learn what we wanted to do. And we are just shy of 100 of them done. And this was the research element. So one-to-ones should have been sat in a farm office. This back in 21 was still at the tail end of COVID, so we actually did these over Teams or Zoom. But we would have myself and other basis qualified people from within ADAS would sit down with a farmer and go through the plan step by step. The workshops, we gathered people together. Again, was going to be in a village hall or similar, but it turned out being online. Again, went through the process with them, and then asked people to go away and complete the IPM plans afterwards. And then self-complete was send them out with some guidance notes as to how to do them. So yes, we've got 100 people that did those. And then again on the back of the research, you can read this, but basically, was it worth doing it? And the majority of people either strongly or slightly agreed. So it was quite encouraging that the people we'd engaged with were feeling there was a value to a bit more IPM planning than just a box ticking, a bit more making them think. So future versions of this is now available online. I'm not going to go through it in great detail because it's there. It's IPMtool.net, which will be up on a screen in a minute. Similarly, you can register. There's some videos and written guidance. It's just occurred to me that we've probably missed a trick and we haven't yet put Neil's videos connected to it, Phil, but that's one for the future. Steering group, lots of people contributed to that, so thank you to all of those. And this one, so you can then go, you can list your farms, and you can choose your crops and cropping year. We've set it up so that you can copy from one year to the next, so you're not answering all the questions again, but we're very, very much of the view that that isn't an excuse to tick a box for an SFI payment. You copy from one year to the next, so you then review what you answered last year and go through and say, this is what I'm thinking. We've also brought in some benchmarking because, so yeah, again, what you want to go online and play with this. It's not worth me going through it and trying to go through it in detail now. So you've got, do you have a record? Yes on paper, yes in my head. And then you can also look at what other people are doing. Not a great example, this one, but the idea being that if you have a particular problem on farm, you can look and see, well, are other people actually using this? Because ultimately, knowing what other farmers are doing will lead you more than what researchers have done. So that's the idea behind the benchmarking. And then within similar to the Excel version, you select your problems, weeds, pests and diseases. The links go currently to HDB pages, but yeah, because they're a pretty good source of advice across the board. And then you can select what level of risk, and it will tell you what you thought it was last year as well, as you go through. And again, then once you've selected your problems, interestingly, only brown rust has come up in this particular example, but it then tells you, if you've said brown rust is a problem, here are some control measures that are useful. The question marks, possibly, no, will give you a bit more detail, and again, there's a link to more detail, a place to put notes, and so on and so forth. So that was the idea of the planning tool, and you then do produce a plan at the end of it, which can be run off as a PDF. So the whole idea behind this was to put together something that doesn't just go, am I doing IPM? It goes, what are your problems? Here are some potential IPM solutions. Are you doing them? And to my mind, across those IPM solutions, it should be, yes, I am, jolly good. No, I'm not, but I'm thinking about doing it. No, I'm not, because it doesn't suit my system. If it falls into the no, I'm not, because I don't want to, then that should be a prompt to have a conversation with your agronomist. Because, of course, as a farmer, you'll be completing this, one hopes, with your agronomist, not sending the link to your agronomist so you can fill it in ready for your farm assurance or SFI review. Yeah, and it's got space to put your basis number and so on and so forth on there. And this one, so bear in mind the last one we had about 100 completed with the Excel version. Thank you very much to Phil for doing the graph for me here. So we've had just shy of 1,500 individual users, and we're just nearly up to 3,000 plans. So this is live, and we're pretty pleased with how this one's going. Yes, so next question, please. And if not, why not? And again, so hopefully you'll be answering that. So, next things for the tool, and have a think. So we'll just run through these. So we are sort of between projects at the moment, and the tool is running, but we're not currently doing any more development work on it. We're hoping to get some more development work to do, and on the back of that, I'd be interested in what people think we ought to do, what we ought to add to it. Now, I appreciate this is whether you've used it or not. If you've used it, that's great, because you'll have an idea of what you'd like adding to it. If you've not used it, what would be useful in an IPM planning tool? So I'll run through these. Improving report function, sorry, this is many screens in front of me, isn't it? Improving report function is basically bringing more detail into that. I think that's pretty much a given. So everything that you enter in the plan is reported back into in the PDF report that comes out. Recording land areas is something we're not sure of whether it has massive value on a farm scale or not. There possibly is value to that in terms of recording overall IPM uptake, but that's why that's in there. Mapping we had a go with, and it didn't get very well received, but again I'm interested in what people think. The challenge with this is if it gets down to a field scale, it's not going to get done, because there'll be too much detail involved. So therefore you're then mapping big areas. Where does it fit, really? To my mind, mapping is a big part of IPM. I mean, when I was farm managing, I had a folder on the desk that showed where all our weed problems were on paper maps. There's better technological versions of doing that electronically now with GPS and so on and so forth. I don't know whether bringing that into the tool is that beneficial, rather than just saying, yes, I have a map of it, and this is where I keep it. Additional crops, we are currently standing at winter and spring cereals, oats, wheat and barley, beans, winter and spring, peas, sugar beet, potatoes, maize, apples and field brassicas, and also rape. We have the option of putting other crops in, if there's anything that you feel we're particularly missing off that list. So at the moment, if you put another crop in, we are reliant on you doing all of your research, whereas as it's on the crops that are listed, it suggests what the problems could be, it suggests what the solutions could be. So yeah, that's to bring that one in. Regional benchmarking, another one we've thought about. You know, is it more useful to know what another East Anglian cereal grower is doing compared to what the whole spread of people across the country are doing for that? Expand control options. Some of these are quite, and some of this feeds into the original research, feeds back to the original research. Control option for, there's a big lump of cultivation technique. Should we bring that out further? So there's more options to say what that cultivation technique is and look at how that impacts different issues. Integration with other IPM software. Mark's going to talk about other IPM software next, I believe, or bits of. So that's the consideration there. Integration with farm management software. Yeah, slightly ties in with the mapping, potentially the recording of land areas. Yeah, how useful would it be that gatekeeper, or probably not gatekeeper now in most people's cases, let's be honest, whatever is feeding into this. So you don't have to enter your cropping because it's already extracted it from somewhere else. Likewise, pesticide usage data. Obviously, we've looked at some of the pest and disease survey stuff. There's information out there. How much of this is useful to you as farmers and agronomists, I think is worth thinking about, and then suggestions. And hopefully, we'll now go, I don't know, can they do multiple? Oh, so you'll have to choose your favourite on this one, and then get in touch with me afterwards. But yeah, presumably that's all on your phones, so you can have a look at that one. And then, yeah, there's then an option, I presume this will cycle through, you can then put, if there's anything else you'd like to include on there. And then there's my details, and yeah, IPMtool.net. But yeah, it's coming at it with a farmer hat on, I think it's useful, because there is a load of information out there, and I think it's a good way of steering people towards it. And some of those, right back when we did the first Excel version, some of those farmers I did the one-to-ones with, I did with the farmer and the agronomist, and we had some really good three-way conversations. I feel, yeah, often these things work better for having someone questioning you, even if that's just an IPM tool that makes you question your sort of what your plan is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. If you do want to comment more specifically on the IPM plan, then please do catch John or Phil later today. So the final speaker is me, and I'm going to talk a bit about IPM resources. Now, I could spend an entire morning going through lots of other resources as well as the plan, all these things that are available, but we obviously don't have time for that. So this is going to be a bit of a quick summary of some of the things that are out there that can be used to support decision making, to improve IPM approaches. And really they fall into these 5 categories. So we can support improved training, we can develop case studies that give examples of IPM in practice, we can help to improve planning around IPM and tools that support either discussion around that planning or develop the plans themselves. There are monitoring and forecast resources, and there's also the networking side of things to actually connect people and getting that discussion going. So I'm just going to work through some examples of these different resources, and I'm happy to discuss them more at lunch and other thing the rest of the day as well. So the first one is training, and there's lots of, we know that IPM is a really knowledge intensive subject. So there's always going to be training resources that can help you capture that knowledge and improve your understanding. And I think that there's something that Rosemary said earlier, was that need for a good, strong understanding of the biology of some of these pests, because everything else comes out of that. If we've got a good understanding of the biology, we can then start to see how all the other approaches fit into that. And that's where some of this training comes in. So I just wanted to flag up a couple of resources. One comes from the IPMWORKS project, which was an EU-funded project where we created a number of modules on integrated pest management, These are all freely available modules. They're short videos and supporting bits and pieces that are in the IPMWORKS toolbox. And they range from a basic understanding of what an IPM approach is through to some more specific things on integrated disease, weed, and invertebrate management. And also how we can actually discuss some of these things. So there's some training on how we can hold a group meeting and discuss IPM and get to the heart of what people's challenges are. So I do recommend finding those and having a look at them. I'll try and make sure all the links are sent around to all of these after today as well. The other one is the videos that Holly mentioned, the Integrated Pest Management Science and Practice videos that Neil Paverley and Frank van den Bosch developed. These, again, are all available on YouTube, and they are targeted at disease management in cereals, but the principles of them can be applied across to other aspects of crop protection. I've started watching those. I started watching those about 6 months ago, and I'm working my way through, and I've not finished yet. They are not quick, easy videos to watch. This is a serious breakdown of the challenges and solutions, working through the biology and the practical elements of disease management. So they do take some time to sit there and really take in and really appreciate how they can be applied into practical approaches. But I thoroughly recommend them. They are really good summaries of the challenges and approaches that we can take. Holly again mentioned some case studies that Defra have funded. We also, in the IPMWORKS project, developed some case studies where we were looking at specific IPM approaches in field. And so what we were doing was taking, maybe splitting a field or doing a tramline approach, or looking at two comparable fields in contrast, and then quantifying the different elements of IPM going on. So this meant we could really quantify the difference that different approaches were having. Maybe it had an impact on yield, maybe it had an impact on severity of the diseases they were targeting, and we were able to capture that and write these reports up. So these case studies from quite a diverse range of crops in different systems, because we were looking not only at arable, but in horticulture, protected crops, vineyards and orchards right across Europe. But they really capture the ethos of this philosophical approach, that you need different combinations of IPM tactics to achieve good control. So we've released a couple of these already. One of them was looking at companion cropping in winter oilseed rape, and that was targeting not just one pest, but it was looking at weeds, weed suppression, as well as giving some confidence against flea beetle, albeit in Scotland where the pressure is quite low, but trying to understand, can we use companion cropping to get ahead of that threat if it does move further north? If you'd like to know more about that particular example or about the IPM hub approach, then I'm going to point you at Andrew Christie, who's here from Scotland today, trying to hide from me. But he led the Scottish hub up in Scotland, where he was working with the farmers to develop not just this case study, but their overall approach and some of the challenges that they were managing up there. That hub approach is something that we're taking forward in IPMNet, something that Ella already mentioned, and we are doing a few hubs this year, and we'd like to do more of, trying to capture that group approach to the challenges. John gave a detailed overview of the IPM tool already, and Dave said as well, there is the IPM plan that the NFU developed and is still live. Both of these plans will help develop an approach. So we're not saying pick one or the other, but having these IPM tools is really important. These plans are a fundamental part of IPM, and so we need to make sure that people have a good way of developing their plans that really captures the challenges and gives them the resources to advance their approaches. Julie talked about the pest and disease survey, and that gives us a kind of retrospective look at what happened in previous years. And we learn from that, we can see how that was reflected in management during the year, but it also means we can start to develop forecast tools based on that data. We know how important monitoring in the field is, and there's lots of tools that are being developed to support that monitoring. A bit more so in horticulture and protected crops, because it's just a bit easier because you're looking at a smaller scale. But there are some fantastic monitoring resources out there. And my own distraction in life is the IPM Decisions platform, which we developed again as part of an EU project, but is freely available right across Europe. So this is bringing together forecasts that have been developed in lots of different countries and getting them really through to advisors and farmers anywhere. There's quite a few good models on there already. We will add more in the future, and they help to just reduce some of that ambiguity about which pests are going to be a problem at which time. Because our vision in this was to try and reduce pesticide wastage. Again, I'm starting to just say the same things that everyone else is saying, but that's because these are really key messages. Good farming is putting the right products in the right place at the right time. No one wants to waste any of these products. So if we can have good forecasts that tell us when the pests are likely to be an issue, that helps us target the management. It also means we can have more confidence in saying, well, actually, this pest probably isn't going to be a threat this year. So I don't have to do anything about this one, and I can focus my attention elsewhere. There's lots more work that needs to be done in this, and we need to make sure that the models that are being supported in the platform are validated and demonstrated so that you have the trust that you need in them to help for them to be consulted as part of management processes. But we are at the starting point of this, and the platform gives us a really good way of getting these models out into practice. One of the nice things about this platform is that it's really sped up the research and innovation side of these things. So we worked with Rosemary, in fact, on some of the models that were running for a long time in the UK, but for so long that they were going to be made obsolete because they just didn't have the software support that they needed. So we were able to embed those into the platform, and that was something that could have taken years. Actually, we did that in about 6 months. We've then been talking to developers in Belgium who like those models, and now we can try and make those available in Belgium much more quickly than we'd have been able to otherwise. And we can see that coming in the other direction as well, where there are good models that have been developed in Scandinavia. We can start to make those available in the UK. Yes, we've got to validate them. Yes, we need to make sure that they are reliable, but the speed at which we can do that is now much quicker than it would have been 5 years ago. So another final quick poll. I just want to get an idea of which of these resources you find most helpful. I don't know if they can pick 3. We did think ahead, good. So if you pick the 3 of these that you think are the most useful, I'm just interested because that'll help us focus our efforts on which ones we can take forward. I'll leave that for a moment. We are going to finish this session in a few minutes, and we will close the online session before we have a few final questions for the speakers, and then we'll break for lunch. So thank you very much. The polls should stay open even after I go forward. You will all have received IPMNet bulletins from me. We are trying to put these out every week, and really the idea of this is rather than trying to overwhelm everyone with IPM solutions, which we don't have, we want to try and increase engagement on this topic. I hope from this morning's sessions you've seen that integrated pest management, being a philosophy, is something that sometimes gets put to the side. But we need to stop that. We need to bring IPM back into the center of our thinking, because otherwise maybe we won't see the repercussions this year or next year, but over the next 10 years we're going to have some really big problems if we don't get to grips with integrated approaches to pest management. So the IPMNet bulletin the idea is to trickle out information to try and bring all these things together so that you can access whether it's information on resistance management or variety selection or find out what people are doing in different sectors. Try and bring that all together. So we'll continue to do that for the next 6 weeks ahead of the season. When we get into the season, we will try and then switch focus to alerts to any particular pests that are starting to be seen through the spring. And I'll be pushing these videos on a weekly basis as well because they are really good. The networking element is really important. IPMNet is there to try and support this engagement, to try and provoke these discussions. We see the hubs as a more practical way of targeting some particular attention to particular pests, but I don't want us to be precious about this. There are lots of other networks and groups and people working on these things. So we hope that we can start to bring them all together to at least share information across the different networks that are going on. But what's important is that we are engaging with these networks, whether you're in an IPMNET BYDV hub, or you're in a NIAB group, or if you're in an IPMWORKS hub in Scotland. As long as we keep these discussions going and sharing the information, that's really important. The data sharing part is very important as well, because there's always a risk that if you just talk about things, you just reinforce what you think you know, rather than really getting to the bottom of actually what is happening. So the data collection is difficult but important, and we'll try and keep that moving, keep trying to be as standardized as possible so that data is meaningful and can really help improve decision making. This network is part of an EU network as well, so we are looking to share information across colleagues in Ireland, in Denmark, in Belgium, and across Europe, to make sure we're not missing anything that they're learning as well, and to share the information back as well. So we will be doing more cross visits and things like that, so there's opportunities to discuss with agronomists and farmers outside of your usual networks, and that's really important, again, in trying to open up and provoke discussion. With that, I will close the morning sessions, so we'll close the live stream now, and then we've got a few minutes before lunch for any questions from anyone in the room. You can use Slido, you can address it to any particular speakers, but open to anything now.